Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. My name is Abner Claiborne, and I've been sheriff of Pima County Southern District for 16 years. Before that, I spent 9 years working border patrol stations along the Arizona-Mexico line, where the desert stretches endlessly in every direction, and the heat can kill you before you realize you're in trouble. Pima County sits in the heart of the Sonoran Desert, a landscape of saguaro cacti, creosote bushes, and mountains that rise like broken teeth against skies so blue they hurt your eyes. We cover thousands of square miles with a sparse population scattered across ranches, mining towns, and communities that exist primarily because someone once thought there might be copper or silver in the nearby hills. The Southern District is different from Tucson and its suburbs. Down here, we're dealing with a different kind of law enforcement. Border crossings, drug smuggling routes, human trafficking corridors, and the constant challenge of policing an area where cell phone coverage is spotty at best, and backup might be an hour away if you're lucky. It's the kind of work that teaches you to trust your instincts, read the landscape, and understand that not everything you encounter will have a simple explanation. The desert keeps its secrets, and sometimes those secrets involve people doing things they hope will never come to light. October 17th, 2021. Started like most autumn days in southern Arizona. The temperature was already pushing 90 degrees by 9 in the morning, and the monsoon season had ended weeks earlier, leaving the arroyos and dry riverbeds as dusty and barren as they'd been since spring. I was at my desk in the small sheriff's station in Arivaca, a community of maybe 600 people that serves as the hub for the ranches and properties scattered throughout the surrounding desert. The station was modest, just me, 2 deputies, and a dispatcher who worked part-time because the county budget wouldn't stretch to cover full-time staffing for what they considered a remote outpost. Deputy Jonas Pike knocked on my office door at 9:43. Pike was in his early 30s, born and raised in Tucson, and had transferred down to the Southern District about 2 years earlier. He was thorough, reliable, and had the kind of quiet competence that made him good at the job without needing constant supervision. He'd worked the border region long enough to understand that things down here operated according to different rules than they did in the city, and he'd learned to navigate the complex relationships between law enforcement, ranchers, border communities, and the various federal agencies that operated in the area. "Sheriff, we've got something strange out on the Buenos Aires Wildlife Refuge. Park Ranger called it in about 20 minutes ago. Says there's an abandoned patrol vehicle in the Aguirre Wash, but it's not from any agency he recognizes." Pike handed me a slip of paper with coordinates and a brief description. I studied it for a moment, feeling that familiar tightening in my gut that came when something didn't add up correctly. The Buenos Aires National Wildlife Refuge covered over 100,000 acres of protected desert and grassland just north of the Mexican border. It was beautiful country, home to pronghorn antelope, javelina, and dozens of bird species that drew wildlife enthusiasts from around the world. It was also a known corridor for border crossings, both by people seeking work in the United States and by drug traffickers moving product north from Sonora. The refuge rangers worked closely with Border Patrol and local law enforcement, and they knew every vehicle that had legitimate business in the area. An unidentified patrol vehicle was definitely unusual. "Did the ranger give any description of the vehicle?" I asked, reaching for my hat and keys. Pike consulted his notes, reading from the information the dispatcher had taken during the call. "White Ford Explorer. Older model, maybe 10 or 12 years old. It's got light bar on top, but no agency markings he could identify. The ranger said it looks like it's been there for a few days, maybe longer. He only found it because he was tracking some pronghorn movement in that section of the refuge. I grabbed my radio and told our dispatcher Maria that Pike and I were heading out to the wildlife refuge to investigate. The drive would take about 45 minutes through desert country that was spectacular and unforgiving in equal measure. The Aguirre Wash was a dry riverbed that only carried water during the heaviest monsoon rains, and even then only for a few hours before the desert soil absorbed everything and returned the landscape to its normal state of parched emptiness. Finding an abandoned vehicle out there raised immediate questions about what had happened and why someone had left it in such a remote location. We took my department-issued Chevy Tahoe, equipped with extra water, emergency supplies, and the kind of heavy-duty suspension necessary for navigating roads that were often little more than 2 tracks through the desert. Pike rode shotgun, and we spent the first part of the drive discussing possible explanations for the abandoned vehicle. Neither of us liked the scenarios we were coming up with. Abandoned patrol vehicles in remote desert locations usually meant one of several things, none of them good. Either someone had gotten into serious trouble and abandoned the vehicle while fleeing, or the vehicle had been stolen and dumped after being used for illegal purposes, or, worst of all, something had happened to whoever had been driving it. The Buenos Aires Wildlife Refuge headquarters sat just off Highway 286, a long, straight road that connected the small community of Sasabe on the Mexican border with the town of Robles Junction to the north. We checked in with the ranger station, where a young woman named Sarah Martinez was coordinating the day's activities. She directed us to meet with the ranger who'd found the vehicle, a man named Tom Breslin, who'd worked the refuge for the better part of 15 years and knew the landscape as well as anyone. Breslin was waiting for us in the parking area, leaning against his ranger vehicle and drinking from a water bottle. He was in his 50s, weathered by years of outdoor work, with the kind of economical movements that suggested someone who'd learned to conserve energy in the desert heat. "Sheriff Claiborne, thanks for coming out. This vehicle situation has been bothering me since I found it yesterday afternoon. I've been working this refuge for 15 years, and I've never seen anything quite like it." We followed Breslin's truck along a dirt road that wound through the refuge, passing stands of mesquite and acacia trees, grasslands where pronghorn grazed in small groups, and the occasional windmill that marked old ranch sites from before the land had been converted to a wildlife refuge. The landscape was beautiful in its stark simplicity, all earth tones and endless sky, with mountains visible in every direction marking the boundaries of the basin we were crossing. After about 20 minutes, Breslin turned off the main road onto a barely visible track that led toward what he called the Aguirre Wash. The wash itself was a wide, sandy riverbed cutting through the landscape like a scar. The banks were steep in places, and the sandy bottom showed the characteristic patterns of water erosion, even though it had been months since any significant rain had fallen. Breslin led us along the wash for perhaps half a mile before stopping and pointing ahead to where a white Ford Explorer sat at an angle in the sand, its front wheels buried up to the axles. The vehicle looked like it had been there for days, maybe longer. Dust covered every surface, and the tire tracks leading to its current position had been partially obscured by wind. As we approached on foot, I could see that Pike had been right about the light bar on top, but there were no agency decals on the doors, no identifying information visible from the outside. The windows were tinted dark enough that I couldn't see into the interior from a distance. Something about the scene felt wrong in a way I couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't just the abandoned vehicle or the remote location. It was something about the way the vehicle sat in the wash, positioned at an angle that suggested it had been deliberately parked rather than accidentally stuck. I approached carefully, one hand resting on my sidearm out of habit more than any specific threat assessment. Pike circled around to the passenger side while Breslin hung back near his Ranger truck, letting law enforcement handle what might be a crime scene. The driver's side door was unlocked, and when I opened it, the interior heat hit me like a physical force. The vehicle had been sitting in direct sunlight for days, and the temperature inside must have been well over 140 degrees. But it was what I saw inside that made me stop and signal to Pike that we had a situation. The vehicle's interior was standard law enforcement configuration. Laptop mount between the front seats, radio equipment, shotgun rack, all the usual equipment you'd expect in a patrol vehicle. But everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, and there was no indication of recent use. The laptop was missing from its mount, and the radio equipment looked like it had been powered off for some time. On the passenger seat sat a small digital voice recorder, the kind that law enforcement officers sometimes used to document observations during patrol. I pulled evidence gloves from my pocket and carefully picked up the recorder. It was an older model, probably 5 or 6 years old, with a small screen showing that it contained several recorded files. The battery indicator showed it was nearly dead, but there was enough power left to review what had been recorded. Pike leaned in through the passenger door, and together we examined the device. The most recent file was dated 5 days earlier, October 12th, and the timestamp showed it had been recorded at 11:47 p.m. I pressed play, and after a moment of static, a man's voice filled the interior of the abandoned vehicle. The voice was professional, measured, delivering what sounded like a routine patrol observation. "This is Deputy Martinez, October 12th, 11:47 p.m. I'm conducting surveillance on County Road S-19 approximately 2 miles north of the Esperanza Ranch turnoff. I've observed 3 vehicles in the past hour traveling south toward the border, all matching the description of vehicles associated with the Hermosillo operation. No visible cargo, but the travel pattern is consistent with spotters or advanced scouts." The recording continued for another minute with Martinez describing vehicle makes, models, and license plate numbers before ending abruptly. I looked at Pike, who was already pulling out his notebook to write down the information. "Do we have any Deputy Martinez in the Southern District? Anyone who might have been working this area 5 days ago?" Pike shook his head slowly, his expression troubled. "Not that I know of. Our department doesn't have anyone named Martinez currently, and I don't recognize that voice, but the way he's talking, the terminology he's using, that's definitely law enforcement." I scrolled through the other files on the recorder. There were 7 in total, all recorded over a span of about 3 weeks in late September and early October. Each one was similar. Martinez documenting surveillance observations, describing vehicles and individuals, noting patterns of movement that he clearly believed were connected to illegal border operations. The recordings were professional, detailed, and increasingly concerned in tone. By the final recording, the one made on October 12th, Martinez's voice carried an edge of tension that suggested he knew he was documenting something dangerous. We spent the next hour processing the vehicle as a potential crime scene. Pike photographed everything while I documented the contents and searched for any identification or additional evidence that might tell us who Deputy Martinez was and what had happened to him. We found very little. No wallet, no badge, no personal effects beyond a half-empty water bottle in the cup holder and a road map of southern Pima County folded on the back seat. The map had several locations marked in pencil, all of them along roads near the border, all of them in remote areas where surveillance could be conducted without being easily observed. What we didn't find was almost as significant as what we did find. There was no blood, no signs of struggle, no indication that violence had occurred in or around the vehicle. The keys were still in the ignition, and when I tried to start the engine, it turned over immediately despite sitting in the desert heat for days. The fuel gauge showed half a tank, and all the vehicle's systems appeared to be functioning normally. Whoever had left this vehicle here had done so deliberately, and they'd left it in working condition. That suggested they'd either been picked up by someone else or had walked away from the vehicle for reasons we didn't yet understand. Breslin had been patient while we processed the vehicle, but now he walked over with a concerned expression. "Sheriff, I need to show you something else. When I was tracking yesterday, I found a campsite about a quarter-mile from here. Someone had been staying out here recently, maybe watching this area. I didn't disturb anything, but I think you need to see it." We followed Breslin along the wash and then up a narrow trail that climbed the bank to a flat area overlooking the riverbed. The campsite was minimal, just a small depression behind some rocks that provided shade during the day and concealment from anyone passing through the wash below. Someone had cleared the area of larger rocks and had arranged smaller stones to create a fire ring, though there was no evidence that any fire had been lit recently. What caught my attention was the observation setup. Someone had positioned themselves with a clear view of the wash and the surrounding area, and they'd done it with the kind of careful attention to detail that suggested training and experience. There were boot prints in the dusty soil, all from the same pair of boots, indicating that one person had been using this location. Scattered around the observation point were water bottles, energy bar wrappers, and a small pair of binoculars that had been left behind when whoever had been using the site departed. Pike was already photographing the site while I carefully examined the binoculars. They were standard civilian models, nothing special, but they'd been well used and showed signs of having been in desert conditions for an extended period. I scanned the surrounding area, trying to piece together what we were looking at. Someone, presumably Deputy Martinez, had been conducting surveillance from this location, watching the wash and the roads that intersected it, documenting vehicle traffic that he believed was connected to illegal border operations. But who was he working for, and why had he abandoned his vehicle and observation post? The sun was directly overhead now, pushing the temperature well into the 90s, and the heat radiating off the rocks and sand created shimmering waves that distorted distant objects. We needed to get back to the station and start making calls to figure out who Deputy Martinez was and what agency he might have been working for. But before we left, I wanted to understand the landscape better, to see what Martinez had been seeing from his observation point. Looking south from the elevated position, I could see for miles across the desert toward the Mexican border, which was marked by the vehicle barrier and Border Patrol infrastructure visible as a thin line cutting across the landscape. To the north, several dirt roads were visible, winding through the desert and connecting remote ranches and properties to the main highway. This was indeed an ideal location for surveillance, offering clear views in multiple directions while providing concealment for anyone who knew how to use the terrain properly. If Martinez had been tracking smuggling operations, this observation point would have allowed him to document vehicle movements without being easily detected. We secured both the vehicle and the observation site as potential crime scenes, marking them with evidence tape and documenting GPS coordinates for future reference. Breslin promised to keep the area restricted and to notify us immediately if anyone approached either location. On the drive back to the Arivaca station, Pike and I discussed what we'd found and what our next steps should be. The voice recordings were the most significant evidence, not just because they documented Martinez's surveillance activities, but because they might contain information about illegal operations that were still active in the area. Back at the station, I immediately started making calls. I contacted every law enforcement agency that operated in southern Arizona, Border Patrol, DEA, FBI, State Police, asking if anyone had an officer named Martinez who might have been working the area around the Buenos Aires Wildlife Refuge. The responses were consistent and troubling. No one had any record of a Deputy Martinez working in Pima County. Border Patrol had several agents named Martinez, but none of them matched the voice on the recordings or had been assigned to surveillance operations in that specific area. The DEA had no active operations in the immediate vicinity, and the FBI confirmed they had no agents working that section of the border. By late afternoon, I'd exhausted all the obvious possibilities and was left with a mystery that was becoming more disturbing the longer I thought about it. We had abandoned patrol vehicle, detailed surveillance recordings, and evidence of sustained observation activities, but no deputy, no agency claiming responsibility, and no explanation for why everything had been left behind. Pike suggested one possibility that neither of us wanted to consider but couldn't ignore. What if Martinez wasn't official law enforcement at all? What if he'd been conducting unauthorized surveillance, perhaps as a private citizen or as part of some other organization? That evening, I sat in my office and listened to all 7 recordings multiple times, taking detailed notes on everything Martinez had documented. The pattern that emerged was consistent and disturbing. Martinez had been tracking what he called the Hermosillo operation, a name that suggested connections to the Mexican city of Hermosillo, capital of Sonora State, and a known hub for drug trafficking organizations. The vehicles he'd been documenting were using specific routes through the desert, traveling at night, and following patterns that suggested careful coordination. Most significantly, Martinez had noted that some of the vehicles appeared to be transporting people rather than drugs, and his tone in the later recordings suggested he'd discovered something that went beyond simple border smuggling. In the final recording, made on October 12th, just hours before the vehicle was presumably abandoned, Martinez's voice carried a tension that suggested fear, or at least serious concern. He'd documented seeing vehicles that he recognized from previous surveillance, but this time they'd been accompanied by what he described as official vehicles, potentially law enforcement or border security vehicles that appeared to be providing escort or protection for the smuggling operation. If Martinez's observations were accurate, they suggested something far more serious than routine border crime. They suggested corruption, collaboration between legitimate authorities and criminal organizations, and the kind of conspiracy that could put anyone investigating it in serious danger. I made a decision that night to involve May Hollister, a Border Patrol agent I'd worked with for years and trusted completely. Hollister was based out of the Tucson sector headquarters, but spent considerable time in the field, particularly in areas known for trafficking activity. She had contacts throughout the region and understood the complex dynamics between various law enforcement agencies, criminal organizations, and the communities caught in between. If anyone could help me figure out who Deputy Martinez was and what he'd discovered, it was May Hollister. May Hollister arrived at the Arivaca station the next morning, driving her personal truck rather than an official Border Patrol vehicle. That told me immediately that she understood the sensitivity of what we were dealing with and wasn't taking any chances on being observed by people who might be monitoring official agency movements. Hollister was in her early 40s, a 20-year veteran of Border Patrol, who'd worked her way up from line agent to intelligence specialist, and she had the kind of institutional knowledge that made her invaluable for understanding the complex dynamics of border security and smuggling operations in southern Arizona. We sat in my office with the door closed while I played the recordings for her. Hollister listened without interrupting, her expression growing more troubled with each file. When the final recording ended, the one from October 12th where Martinez described seeing official vehicles apparently providing protection for smuggling operations, she sat back in her chair and was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Abner, how many people know about these recordings?" Her voice was careful, measured in the way of someone who understood that the wrong answer could create serious problems. "Just Pike and myself from my department. And now you. The ranger who found the vehicle doesn't know about the recordings, and I haven't shared this with anyone else. I wanted to talk to you first because frankly I don't know who to trust with this." Hollister nodded approvingly, then leaned forward with her elbows on my desk. gut instincts, if Martinez was documenting what I think he was documenting, then we're looking at something that goes way beyond routine smuggling. The Hermosillo operation he keeps mentioning, I've heard rumors about that for the past year, but nothing concrete enough to investigate officially. She explained that intelligence reports had been circulating within Border Patrol about a sophisticated trafficking network operating out of Hermosillo, moving both drugs and people through carefully coordinated routes in southern Arizona. What made this operation different from the typical smuggling activities was the level of organization and the apparent ability to move product and people through areas that should have been heavily monitored. Several agents had raised concerns that someone was providing inside information about patrol schedules, checkpoint locations, and surveillance activities, but no one had been able to prove anything or identify who might be compromised. The suggestion that official vehicles were providing protection or escort services took the situation to an entirely different level. If Martinez's observations were accurate, it meant corruption within law enforcement or border security agencies, the kind of corruption that could compromise entire operations and put legitimate officers at risk. It also meant that investigating this situation would require extreme caution, because we couldn't know who might be involved or how deep the corruption ran. Hollister made it clear that she couldn't pursue this through official Border Patrol channels without raising red flags and potentially alerting whoever was involved. "We need to figure out who Martinez was," Hollister said, pulling out a small notebook. "The voice on those recordings sounds like someone with training and experience. But if he's not official law enforcement, then maybe he was private sector, security contractor, or even a journalist investigating the operation. The equipment in that vehicle, the surveillance setup, the way he documented everything, that all suggests someone who knew what they were doing and had resources to support an extended operation." Pike joined us, and together we developed a plan for investigating Martinez's identity and activities without alerting anyone who might be monitoring official channels. Hollister would use her personal contacts to check with private security firms and investigative agencies that sometimes worked border-related cases. Pike would search through property records and vehicle registrations to see if we could trace the Ford Explorer back to an owner or organization. I would focus on the locations Martinez had marked on his map and try to understand the pattern of movements he'd been documenting. The map we'd found in the abandoned vehicle showed 7 locations marked along roads near the border, each one carefully chosen to provide observation points for vehicle traffic moving through the area. I recognized several of them as places I'd patrolled over the years, remote intersections and lonely stretches of highway where someone could park and watch without being easily noticed. What struck me was how methodically Martinez had approached this surveillance. These weren't random locations. They formed a network covering key routes that anyone moving product or people through southern Pima County would likely use. That afternoon, Pike and I drove out to visit the locations marked on Martinez's map. The first was a pullout on Highway 286, about 15 miles south of Robles Junction, positioned to observe traffic heading toward the border crossing at Sasabe. We found tire tracks in the dust suggesting that a vehicle had been parked there recently, and scattered on the ground were more energy bar wrappers and water bottles, the same brands we'd found at the observation post near the abandoned vehicle. Someone had spent considerable time at this location, and based on the accumulation of debris, it had been regular surveillance over an extended period. The second location was more remote, a dirt road turnoff near the Esperanza Ranch that Martinez had mentioned in one of his recordings. This spot offered a view of a network of ranch roads that connected several properties and eventually led to Highway 286. It was the kind of location that locals would know about, but that wouldn't appear on most maps or GPS systems. Finding this place suggested that Martinez either had extensive knowledge of the area or had received information from someone who did. The observation point here was more elaborate, with rocks arranged to provide cover and sight lines carefully calculated to monitor vehicle traffic without being visible from the road. At each location, we found similar evidence of sustained surveillance activities. Martinez had been working methodically, documenting patterns of movement across multiple observation points, building a comprehensive picture of how the Hermosillo operation was moving its cargo through the area. What troubled me was the timeline. Based on the dates in the recordings and the condition of the evidence we were finding, Martinez had been conducting this surveillance for at least 3 weeks before abandoning his vehicle on October 12th. That meant he'd invested significant time and resources into this investigation, which made his sudden disappearance even more concerning. By late afternoon, we'd visited 6 of the 7 locations marked on the map. The final location was the most remote, a spot along the Altar Valley Road that would require us to drive about 30 miles on dirt roads through some of the most isolated country in southern Arizona. The sun was getting low on the horizon, and Pike suggested we wait until the next morning to visit the last location. But something about the timing bothered me. Martinez's final recording had been made late at night on October 12th, and he'd mentioned observing vehicles traveling south toward the border. If his surveillance had revealed something critical that night, something that had caused him to abandon his operation and disappear, then that final observation point might hold answers we needed. We continued south as the desert took on the golden quality that comes in the hour before sunset. The Altar Valley spread out before us, a vast basin ringed by mountains, with the valley floor covered in grassland and scattered mesquite. This was ranch country. Vast properties where cattle grazed across thousands of acres, and where human presence was measured in people per square mile rather than people per acre. The road deteriorated as we drove south, becoming less maintained and more challenging, requiring careful navigation around rocks and through sandy sections where the Tahoe's 4-wheel drive was essential. The location Martinez had marked was at the intersection of 2 ranch roads, positioned on a slight rise that offered views in 3 directions. As we approached, I could see why he'd chosen this spot. From this elevation, you could observe vehicle traffic on multiple routes, and the position provided natural cover from anyone passing below. We parked about 100 yards away and approached on foot, both of us alert for any indication that someone else might be using this location. What we found at this final observation point was different from the others, and immediately more disturbing. The setup was similar. Rocks arranged for cover, evidence of extended surveillance activities, but there were also signs of hasty departure. Equipment had been left behind, not just the usual water bottles and food wrappers, but more significant items. A small camp stove, a sleeping bag still in its stuff sack, and most concerning, a pair of boots that looked like they'd been removed quickly and left where they'd fallen. The boots were dusty but not particularly worn, and inside one of them, I found a small slip of paper with a phone number written in pencil. Pike was examining the sleeping bag when he called me over with an urgent tone in his voice. Inside the stuff sack, hidden in a way that suggested deliberate concealment, was a manila folder containing photographs and documents. The photographs showed vehicles at night, taken with a telephoto lens from concealed positions, each image carefully documenting license plates, vehicle occupants, and cargo when visible. The quality suggested professional equipment and someone who knew how to conduct surveillance photography. Some images showed Border Patrol vehicles, while others showed civilian trucks and SUVs, all apparently photographed during smuggling operations. The documents were even more significant. Martinez had been compiling a detailed report, organizing his observations into a comprehensive investigation of the Hermosillo operation. The report identified specific routes, estimated schedules for smuggling runs, and most damning, included a list of vehicles that appeared to be providing protection or advance warning to smuggling operations. Several of the vehicles on this list were identified as belonging to law enforcement or border security agencies. Martinez hadn't just been documenting smuggling activities. He'd been building a case for corruption within the agencies responsible for preventing those activities. As I read through Martinez's report, the scope of what he'd uncovered became clear. The Hermosillo operation wasn't just another trafficking network. It was a sophisticated enterprise that had managed to compromise elements of the very system designed to stop it. Martinez had documented at least 6 incidents over 3 weeks where official vehicles had appeared to warn smugglers about checkpoint locations or patrol activities. He'd observed coordinated movements suggesting that smugglers were receiving real-time information about law enforcement positions. Most troubling, he'd identified patterns suggesting that certain officers or agents were being assigned to areas specifically to facilitate smuggling operations rather than prevent them. The sun was setting now, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple, and the temperature was dropping rapidly the way it does in the high desert. We needed to get back to town before full darkness, but I wanted to document everything we'd found at this location carefully. Pike photographed every item while I bagged the folder and its contents as evidence. The boots concerned me most. They suggested that Martinez had left this location in a hurry, possibly without time to gather his equipment or even put on proper footwear. That suggested he'd been discovered, or had discovered something so urgent that immediate departure was necessary. As we were preparing to leave, I noticed something else that made my blood run cold. In the dust near where the boots had been found, there were tire tracks from multiple vehicles, and the tracks showed a pattern suggesting that several vehicles had converged on this location recently. The tracks were relatively fresh, probably within the past week, and they told a story. Several vehicles had arrived, parked in a semicircle around the observation point, and then departed along different routes. It looked exactly like what you'd see if multiple people had come to this location deliberately, perhaps searching for Martinez or investigating his surveillance operation. We drove back to Arivaca in darkness, and neither Pike nor I spoke much during the journey. We were both processing what we'd found and what it meant. Martinez had been conducting an unauthorized investigation into corruption within border security agencies, and he'd gathered enough evidence to create serious problems for whoever was involved in the Hermosillo operation. Then he'd apparently been discovered, had abandoned his surveillance operation in a hurry, and had disappeared. The question now was whether he'd gotten away safely or whether something worse had happened to him. Back at the station, I locked Martinez's report and the photographs in the evidence safe and called Hollister to update her on what we'd found. She listened quietly and then asked the question I'd been avoiding. "Abner, have you considered that Martinez might not have been working alone? That report, those photographs, the level of detail in his surveillance, that's more than one person could gather operating independently. He might have had support, maybe a team, or at least a partner. And if that's the case, we need to figure out who else was involved and whether they're still out there." It was a good point, and one that opened up new possibilities. If Martinez had been part of a larger investigation, then there might be others who knew what he'd discovered and who could provide information about what had happened to him. But it also meant that more people might be at risk, and that whoever was protecting the Hermosillo operation might be looking for them. Hollister promised to dig deeper into her contacts and see if any federal agencies had been running unauthorized investigations in the area. Pike would continue checking records and databases for any trace of Martinez's identity. I would focus on analyzing the evidence we'd gathered and trying to understand the pattern of corruption Martinez had documented. That night, I sat in my home office reviewing Martinez's report for what must have been the 10th time. The document was thorough, professional, and deeply disturbing. Martinez had identified at least 8 individuals who appeared to be providing assistance to the Hermosillo operation, though he'd only been able to confirm identities for 3 of them. The others were described by vehicle numbers or physical descriptions, but the pattern was clear. People in positions of authority were using that authority to facilitate criminal activity rather than prevent it. The money involved must have been substantial, enough to convince multiple individuals to risk their careers and freedom. What struck me most was Martinez's tone in the written report compared to his voice recordings. In the recordings, he'd been professional and controlled, documenting observations with the detachment of a trained investigator. But in the written report, particularly in the sections describing the corruption he'd uncovered, there was anger and frustration that came through despite his attempts at objectivity. Martinez had clearly been someone who believed in the system, who'd expected law enforcement and border security agencies to operate with integrity, and who'd been deeply disillusioned by what he'd discovered. That disillusionment might have driven him to take risks that a more cynical investigator would have avoided. The phone number I'd found in the boot was bothering me. It was obviously significant enough that Martinez had written it down and kept it with him, but I couldn't run it through official databases without potentially alerting whoever might be monitoring those systems. Hollister had warned me that if the corruption ran as deep as Martinez's evidence suggested, then any queries through official channels might be tracked and reported to the people we were investigating. We needed to identify the number without raising red flags, which meant finding alternative methods of investigation. The next morning, I called a friend who worked as a private investigator in Tucson, someone I'd known for years and trusted completely. I gave him the phone number and asked him to run it through private databases and see what he could find, emphasizing that this needed to be done discreetly without any connection to official law enforcement inquiries. He called back 3 hours later with information that added another layer of complexity to the situation. The number belonged to a cell phone registered to a small office in the town of Arivaca, less than 2 miles from my station. The office was listed as belonging to a non-profit organization called the Border Justice Coalition, a group that advocated for immigrant rights and documented human rights abuses along the border. That connection made sense and raised new questions. If Martinez had been working with or receiving information from an immigrant advocacy group, it would explain how he'd learned about smuggling routes and potentially about corruption within enforcement agencies. Groups like the Border Justice Coalition often had contacts within border communities who witnessed trafficking operations and official misconduct, but were afraid to report it through official channels. Martinez might have been investigating the Hermosillo operation on behalf of the coalition, using his law enforcement background to build a case that could be presented to federal authorities or made public to force official action. Pike and I drove over to the Border Justice Coalition office that afternoon. It was located in a small building on Arivaca's main road, sharing space with a community center and a second-hand store. The office was modest, just 2 rooms with filing cabinets, a desk, and walls covered with maps, photographs, and documentation of border issues. A woman in her 30s was working at the desk when we entered, and her expression when she saw our uniforms suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with law enforcement presence. I introduced myself and explained that we were investigating a missing person case and believed the individual might have had contact with their organization. The woman, who identified herself as Sofia Ruiz, the coalition's coordinator, listened carefully and then asked for more details about who we were looking for. When I described the voice recordings and mentioned the name Martinez, her expression changed from caution to something that looked like recognition mixed with concern. She excused herself, went into the back room, and returned a few minutes later with an older man who introduced himself as Father Miguel Santos, a Catholic priest who'd been working with immigrant communities along the border for 30 years. Father Santos had the weathered appearance of someone who'd spent decades in the desert sun, and his eyes held the kind of weariness that comes from witnessing human suffering on a regular basis. He gestured for us to sit and then spoke carefully, choosing his words with precision. "You're asking about someone who called himself Martinez, though that probably wasn't his real name. He came to us about 2 months ago, said he was a former law enforcement officer who wanted to help document abuses and corruption related to border trafficking. He said he had experience conducting investigations and offered to help us gather evidence about operations we'd been hearing about from people in the community. Father Santos led us to a small meeting room in the back of the coalition office where we could talk privately. The room was simple, with a table, several chairs, and more maps on the walls showing the border region with various markings and annotations. Sophia Ruiz joined us, closing the door behind her and taking a seat across from Pike and me. The priest folded his hands on the table and spoke with the careful consideration of someone who understood that what he was about to share could have serious consequences for everyone involved. The man, who called himself Martinez, approached us in early September. He said he'd worked in law enforcement for years, border patrol or maybe state police. He wasn't specific about which agency. He told us he'd become aware of systematic corruption within border security operations. People taking money to look the other way while trafficking networks moved people and drugs through designated corridors. He said he wanted to document this corruption thoroughly enough that federal authorities would have to take action, but he couldn't do it through official channels because he didn't know who could be trusted. Father Santos explained that the coalition had been documenting problems along the border for years, receiving reports from migrants about abusive treatment, from ranchers about property damage caused by both smugglers and enforcement activities, and from community members about officials who seemed more interested in protecting criminal operations than stopping them. They'd compiled extensive documentation, but had struggled to get anyone in authority to take their concerns seriously. When Martinez offered to conduct a professional investigation that could give their documentation more credibility, they'd agreed to support his efforts. The coalition had provided Martinez with information about smuggling routes, schedules that community members had observed, and descriptions of vehicles and individuals who appeared to be involved in trafficking operations. In return, Martinez had used his law enforcement background to conduct surveillance, document patterns of movement, and build a case that connected specific corrupt officials to the Hermosillo operation. For about 6 weeks, the arrangement had worked well. Martinez would conduct surveillance, share his findings with the coalition, and they would provide additional information based on reports from their community contacts. Then, about a week ago, everything had changed. Martinez had contacted Father Santos urgently, saying he'd observed something that proved the corruption went higher than anyone had suspected. He'd been conducting surveillance on October 12th, when he'd seen multiple official vehicles converging on an area near the border where a smuggling operation was taking place. Instead of interdicting the smugglers, the official vehicles had appeared to be coordinating with them, directing them to safe routes and providing advance warning about where other patrol units were located. Martinez had photographed the entire incident and had told Father Santos that the evidence was conclusive and damning. He was supposed to meet with me the next morning, October 13th, to discuss how to present this evidence to federal authorities. Father Santos continued, his expression troubled. But he never showed up for the meeting. I tried calling his cell phone repeatedly, but there was no answer. Sophia and I drove out to the observation point he'd been using, the one near the wildlife refuge, but there was no sign of him. We found his vehicle abandoned in the wash, but we didn't know what to do. We couldn't report him missing to law enforcement because we didn't know if law enforcement was involved in whatever had happened to him. Sophia Ruiz spoke up for the first time, her voice carrying anger mixed with fear. "Sheriff, we see things out here that most people don't want to acknowledge. We see officials working with cartels. We see systematic abuse of migrants. We see a system that's supposed to protect people actually preying on them. When Martinez told us he could prove what was happening, we thought maybe finally someone would have to do something about it. But now he's missing, and we're afraid that whoever he was investigating found out what he was doing." I asked them to describe Martinez in detail, hoping to get information that might help us identify him. Father Santos provided a description that matched what we'd expected from the voice recordings. A man in his 40s or early 50s, average height, fit build, with the bearing and mannerisms of someone with military or law enforcement background. He'd been careful about personal information, never providing details about where he lived or what agency he'd previously worked for. He'd always paid for everything in cash and had been meticulous about not leaving traces of his activities that could be tracked through official databases. The only personal information Martinez had shared was that he'd grown up in Arizona, had worked border security for most of his adult life, and had become increasingly disillusioned by the corruption he'd witnessed. He'd told Father Santos that he'd tried to report problems through official channels but had been stonewalled or threatened, and that he'd eventually concluded that the only way to force change was to gather undeniable evidence and present it to federal authorities who weren't compromised. The investigation he'd been conducting with the coalition's support was his attempt to do exactly that. Pike asked about the phone number we'd found, and Father Santos confirmed it was a disposable cell phone the coalition had provided to Martinez for secure communication. He'd been the only person who'd used that number, and all calls to and from it had been related to his investigation. The fact that we'd found the phone number in his boot at the observation point suggested he'd been planning to make contact with someone, possibly Father Santos or another coalition member, but had been interrupted before he could complete the call. I showed them the photographs and report we'd recovered from the final observation point. Father Santos reviewed them carefully, his expression growing darker with each page. This is what he said he was going to give us. This proves everything we've been saying for years. Look at these vehicle numbers, these dates and times. This shows coordination between official agencies and trafficking networks. If this evidence could be presented to the right people in federal law enforcement, people who aren't compromised, it could bring down the entire corrupt network. But that was the problem, and everyone in the room understood it. If the corruption ran as deep as Martinez's evidence suggested, then presenting this information through normal channels would likely just alert the people involved and give them time to cover their tracks or eliminate evidence. Worse, it could put anyone associated with the investigation at risk. Martinez was already missing, and if the people he'd been investigating had discovered his identity and activities, there was a very real possibility that he'd been silenced permanently. The coalition members were at risk simply because they'd supported his investigation, and now Pike and I were at risk because we'd taken possession of the evidence. Hollister arrived at the coalition office about an hour into our conversation with Father Santos and Sophia. I'd called her after learning about Martinez's connection to the coalition, and she'd driven down from Tucson immediately. After reviewing the photographs and report, she confirmed what we'd all been thinking. The evidence Martinez had gathered was explosive and directly implicated individuals within Border Patrol, county sheriff's departments, and possibly other federal agencies. Several of the vehicle numbers matched Border Patrol units, and the patterns of movement Martinez had documented could only be explained by inside information about patrol schedules and operations. "We need to be very careful about how we handle this," Hollister said, speaking to the group. "If we present this evidence through official channels, it's going to get buried or compromised. But if we go public with it, we're putting everyone associated with this investigation in danger. The people involved in the Hermosillo operation have demonstrated they're willing to use violence to protect their interests. Martinez is missing, presumably because he got too close to exposing them. We need to assume they know about the coalition's involvement, and possibly about Sheriff Claiborne's investigation as well." We spent the next hour discussing options and developing a strategy. Hollister had contacts within the Department of Justice and the FBI's Internal Affairs Division, people she believed could be trusted to handle sensitive corruption cases without leaking information to the subjects of investigation. She proposed that we prepare a comprehensive package including Martinez's evidence, our own investigation findings, and testimony from coalition members, and present it directly to these federal contacts outside of normal channels. It was risky, but it seemed like the only way to ensure the evidence would be acted upon rather than suppressed. Father Santos raised a concern that had been bothering me as well. What about Martinez? If he's still alive, he's in hiding somewhere, probably afraid to make contact because he doesn't know who's compromised. We need to find a way to let him know it's safe to come forward, that his evidence is in the hands of people who will act on it. It was a good point, but I wasn't sure how to accomplish it. Martinez had been careful about operational security, and if he'd gone into hiding, he'd done it in a way that made him difficult to trace. We didn't even know his real identity yet, despite all our investigation. That evening, Pike and I returned to the station and began the process of consolidating all the evidence we'd gathered. We copied Martinez's photographs and report, documented the locations where we'd found evidence, and prepared detailed statements about our investigation. Hollister was doing the same from her end, preparing documentation that would establish the credibility of the evidence and explain the chain of custody in a way that would survive legal scrutiny. The goal was to create a package comprehensive enough and documented thoroughly enough that it couldn't be ignored or dismissed when presented to federal authorities. As we worked, I kept thinking about Martinez and wondering where he might be. If he'd been discovered conducting surveillance on October 12th and had fled in a hurry, he would have needed somewhere safe to hide while he figured out his next move. He couldn't go home, wherever that was, because anyone looking for him would check there first. He couldn't contact law enforcement through normal channels because he couldn't be sure who was compromised. The coalition couldn't shelter him because that would put them at risk and would be one of the first places anyone would look. So, where would a former law enforcement officer with border experience go to hide in southern Arizona? The answer came to me around midnight as I was reviewing Martinez's surveillance notes for what felt like the 100th time. In several of his recordings, he'd mentioned specific ranches and properties where he'd observed suspicious activities. One ranch in particular, a place called the Esperanza Ranch, had come up multiple times in his documentation. Martinez had noted that the ranch appeared to be a staging point for smuggling operations, with vehicles regularly stopping there before heading north toward Tucson or south toward the border. But he'd also noted something else that I'd initially overlooked. The ranch had been abandoned for several years, with the main house and outbuildings sitting empty while the property went through some kind of legal dispute. An abandoned ranch would be an ideal hiding place for someone like Martinez. It would offer shelter from the elements, concealment from anyone searching from the road, and the isolation necessary to stay hidden while monitoring the situation. If Martinez had needed to disappear quickly on the night of October 12th, and if he'd been familiar with the Esperanza Ranch from his surveillance activities, it made sense that he might have gone there. The ranch was only about 10 miles from the observation point where we'd found evidence of his hasty departure, close enough to reach on foot in a few hours if necessary. I called Pike at home and told him my theory. He agreed it was worth checking out, and we made plans to visit the Esperanza Ranch first thing in the morning. I also called Hollister and Father Santos to let them know what we were planning. None of us wanted to get our hopes up too much, but the possibility that Martinez might still be alive and hiding somewhere gave the investigation a renewed sense of urgency. If we could find him and get him to safety, he could provide testimony that would strengthen the case against the corrupt officials he'd been documenting. The drive to Esperanza Ranch took us through some of the most remote country in southern Pima County. The ranch sat at the end of a long dirt road that wound through mesquite-covered hills and across several dry washes. The property had been a working cattle ranch until about 5 years earlier, when the owners had died and the heirs had gotten into legal disputes about what to do with the land. In the meantime, the ranch had sat abandoned, slowly deteriorating in the harsh desert climate. The main house was a single-story adobe structure that looked like it dated from the 1940s. surrounded by several outbuildings, corrals, and what had once been a productive ranch operation. As we approached the ranch, I could see fresh tire tracks in the dust of the access road, suggesting that someone had been here recently despite the property's abandoned status. We parked about a quarter-mile away and approached on foot, both of us alert for any indication of occupancy or danger. The ranch buildings showed the expected signs of abandonment and weather damage, with broken windows, doors hanging open, and the general air of neglect that comes from years without maintenance. But there were also subtle signs that someone had been using the property recently. Footprints in the dust near the main house, disturbed areas where items had been moved, and most tellingly, a small campfire ring behind one of the outbuildings that showed recent use. Pike circled around to approach from the rear while I walked up to the front of the main house, calling out as I approached. "This is Sheriff Claiborne from Pima County. If anyone's here, I need you to come out where I can see you. We're here to help, not to cause problems." There was no immediate response, but I could sense that someone was inside the building, watching and trying to decide whether to reveal themselves. I continued speaking, directing my words toward the house. "If you're the person who is conducting surveillance on the Hermosillo operation, we've found your evidence. We've secured your report and photographs, and we're working with people who can be trusted to act on it. Father Santos and the Border Justice Coalition asked us to find you." After a long moment, a man's voice came from inside the house. The same voice I'd been hearing on the recordings for days. "How do I know you're not with them? How do I know this isn't a trap to get me to come out?" It was a fair question, and one I'd anticipated. Because if we were with them, we'd have brought a lot more people, and we wouldn't be announcing ourselves. We'd have surrounded the building and forced you out. The fact that it's just two of us, and the fact that we know about the coalition, should tell you we're legitimate. But I understand your caution. You've been doing this long enough to know you can't trust just anyone. There was another pause, and then the front door of the house opened slowly. The man who emerged matched the description Father Santos had provided, somewhere in his late 40s or early 50s, with the weathered appearance of someone who'd spent considerable time in the desert recently. He was unshaven, looked like he hadn't slept well in days, and moved with the careful wariness of someone who'd been living on high alert. Most notably, he was barefoot, confirming my suspicion that the boots we'd found at the observation point were his, and that he'd fled that location so quickly he hadn't had time to put them on. "My name's Thomas Garza," he said quietly, keeping his distance and watching both Pike and me carefully. "I used to be a border patrol agent until I couldn't stand the corruption anymore and resigned." Everything in those recordings, everything in that report, it's all true. The Hermosillo operation has people inside Border Patrol, inside county sheriff's departments, maybe even inside federal agencies. They're moving people and drugs through southern Arizona with official protection, and anyone who tries to expose it ends up dead or disappeared. I gestured toward our vehicle, trying to project calm and trustworthiness. "Mr. Garza, we believe you. We've reviewed all your evidence and we're working on presenting it to federal authorities who can act on it. But right now, you're not safe out here alone. We need to get you somewhere secure while we finalize the case. Father Santos and the coalition are worried about you, and they want to know you're okay." Garza looked torn between relief at being found and fear that this might still be some kind of trap. Pike slowly pulled out his phone and called Father Santos, then handed the phone to Garza so he could hear the priest's voice confirming that we were legitimate. After speaking with Father Santos for a few minutes, Garza's tension visibly decreased. He agreed to come with us, though he insisted on bringing a backpack containing additional documentation and evidence he'd been holding as insurance. As we walked back to the vehicle, he told us about the night of October 12th when everything had gone wrong. He'd been conducting surveillance from the observation point when he'd realized that vehicles he'd been photographing were changing their behavior, moving in patterns that suggested they knew they were being watched. Then he'd seen multiple official vehicles converging on his location, and he'd understood that his surveillance had been detected. I grabbed what I could and ran, Garza explained as we drove back toward Arivaca. I didn't even have time to put my boots on properly. I just shoved the most important documents into my jacket and took off across the desert on foot. I watched from a distance as they searched my observation point, and I knew that if they caught me, I'd end up dead in the desert somewhere, listed as another border crossing casualty. I've been hiding at the ranch ever since, trying to figure out who I could trust and how to get the evidence into the right hands without getting killed in the process. Back at the station, we secured Garza in a safe location while Hollister arranged for federal protection. The evidence he'd been carrying in his backpack included additional photographs and documentation that filled in some of the gaps in the material we'd already recovered. More importantly, Garza could provide testimony about what he'd witnessed, identify the corrupt officials he'd documented, and explain the operational details of the Hermosillo operation in a way that would make prosecution possible. With Garza's testimony and the documentary evidence he'd gathered, we had the foundation for a case that could expose and prosecute the corrupt network he'd been investigating. Over the next 72 hours, events moved quickly. Hollister's contacts in the Department of Justice reviewed the evidence and authorized a joint task force investigation involving FBI Internal Affairs, the Justice Department's Public Integrity Section, and trusted elements of Border Patrol's Internal Investigations Unit. The task force moved carefully, aware that the subjects of investigation might have sources within law enforcement who could alert them to the investigation. They used grand jury subpoenas to secure communications records and financial documents, and they conducted simultaneous interviews with multiple suspects to prevent coordination of stories or destruction of evidence. The arrests began on October 26th, just 2 weeks after Garza had abandoned his surveillance operation. Federal agents arrested 8 individuals on charges ranging from corruption and drug trafficking conspiracy to civil rights violations and obstruction of justice. The arrested included 3 Border Patrol agents, 2 county sheriff's deputies from neighboring counties, and 3 civilians who'd been coordinating between the Hermosillo cartel and the corrupt officials. The evidence Garza had gathered, supplemented by the task force's investigation, proved that the Hermosillo operation had been paying officials to provide information about patrol schedules, warn smugglers about enforcement activities, and, in some cases, actively escort smuggling operations through areas they were supposed to be patrolling. The trials began the following spring and stretched through the summer. I testified in 3 separate proceedings, describing how we'd found the abandoned vehicle in the Aguirre Wash, how we'd traced the evidence to Thomas Garza's investigation, and how we'd worked with federal authorities to verify and supplement his findings. Pike testified about the surveillance locations and the evidence we'd recovered. Hollister provided expert testimony about Border Patrol operations and how the corruption had compromised border security in southern Arizona. Father Santos and Sofia Ruiz testified about their work with the coalition and how Garza had approached them seeking support for his investigation. The defendants mounted various defenses, claiming entrapment, arguing that the evidence had been gathered illegally, and suggesting that Garza was a disgruntled former agent with an axe to grind against Border Patrol. But the documentary evidence was overwhelming. Garza's photographs showed officials coordinating with smugglers. Financial records revealed payments from Hermosillo cartel operatives to the defendants' bank accounts. Communications records demonstrated coordination between corrupt officials and trafficking networks. Testimony from smugglers who'd cooperated with prosecutors confirmed that they'd been paying for protection and information. By the time the trials concluded, all 8 defendants had been convicted on multiple counts, and were facing federal prison sentences ranging from 10 to 25 years. The convictions made headlines throughout Arizona and drew national attention to corruption in border security operations. Congressional committees held hearings about systemic problems in enforcement agencies. The Department of Homeland Security launched a comprehensive review of integrity measures within Border Patrol and Customs and Border Protection. Reform advocates cited the case as evidence that border security needed civilian oversight and independent investigation mechanisms. Critics argued that a few corrupt individuals didn't represent systemic problems, and that the real story was about the dedicated majority of officers who did their jobs with integrity despite difficult conditions. I tried to stay out of the political debates, focusing instead on what the case meant for law enforcement in southern Arizona. The prosecutions had exposed real problems, corruption that had compromised operations, and put both officers and civilians at risk. But they'd also demonstrated that the system could work when people were willing to pursue evidence regardless of where it led. Garza had taken enormous risks to document what was happening. Father Santos and the coalition had supported his investigation despite knowing it could put them in danger. Hollister had been willing to pursue evidence against members of her own agency. Pike and I had followed the investigation wherever it took us, even when that meant challenging assumptions about who could be trusted. The aftermath of the case brought changes to how law enforcement operated in the Southern District. The federal task force remained active for more than a year, following leads and investigating additional allegations of corruption that emerged during the initial prosecutions. Several more officials were investigated, though not all investigations resulted in charges. The scrutiny made everyone more careful, more aware that misconduct wouldn't be overlooked simply because it involved people with badges. Some officers resented the increased oversight in internal investigations, arguing that it demonstrated a lack of trust in law enforcement. Others welcomed the accountability, saying it protected honest officers from being tainted by association with corrupt colleagues. Thomas Garza remained in federal protective custody throughout the trials and for several months afterward. The people he'd helped prosecute had connections to violent criminal organizations, and there were legitimate concerns about retaliation. When he finally emerged from protection, Garza moved to another state and took a job in private security that kept him far from the border. Before he left Arizona, he came to visit me at the Arivaca station, wanting to thank everyone who'd helped him and to discuss what the investigation had meant. We sat in my office with coffee and talked for more than an hour about the case and its implications. Garza explained that he'd joined Border Patrol 20 years earlier, with idealistic notions about protecting the country and serving with honor. He'd spent 2 decades working the border, conducting interdictions, processing arrests, and watching as the organizations he was supposed to be fighting grew more sophisticated and more violent. Along the way, he'd begun noticing things that didn't make sense. Smuggling operations that succeeded despite heavy enforcement presence. Information leaks that allowed traffickers to avoid checkpoints and patrols. Colleagues who seemed to have more money than their salaries could explain. For years, Garza had rationalized what he was seeing, telling himself that law enforcement couldn't be perfect, and that some operations would inevitably succeed despite best efforts. But as he rose through the ranks and gained access to more operational information, the pattern became undeniable. Some officials weren't just failing to stop smuggling operations. They were actively facilitating them in exchange for money. The corruption wasn't limited to a few individuals. It was organized, systematic, and protected by a code of silence that made it dangerous to ask questions or raise concerns. I tried going through official channels, Garza said, staring into his coffee cup. I reported concerns to supervisors, filed complaints with Internal Affairs, even contacted the Inspector General's office. Every time, nothing happened. Either the complaints disappeared into bureaucratic processes that went nowhere, Or I got called in for meetings where I was told to focus on my own work and stop making trouble. After a while, I realized that the corruption went high enough that official channels were compromised. Anyone I reported to either was involved themselves or was protecting people who were involved. That realization had led Garza to resign from Border Patrol and begin his unauthorized investigation. He'd spent several months planning how to document the corruption thoroughly enough that it couldn't be ignored or buried. He'd used his law enforcement background to identify surveillance locations and develop techniques for documenting smuggling operations without being detected. He'd approached the Border Justice Coalition because he knew they'd been documenting problems for years and had community contacts who could provide information that he couldn't access through official channels. The partnership had worked well until the night when his surveillance had been discovered and he'd been forced to flee. Living at that abandoned ranch for 10 days was the hardest thing I've ever done, Garza admitted. I didn't know who I could trust. I didn't know if anyone would find the evidence I'd left behind, or if it would just sit in that riverbed until the next monsoon washed it away. Every night I'd hear vehicles on the roads and wonder if they were searching for me. I kept thinking about what happens to people who cross the cartels or expose official corruption. They disappear into the desert, and eventually someone finds remains that can't be identified. I was convinced that was going to be my fate. I asked Garza what he thought the long-term impact of the investigation would be. He considered the question carefully before responding. Honestly, Sheriff, I don't know if anything will really change. We took down 8 people, but the Hermosillo operation is still functioning. They'll recruit new officials to replace the ones we arrested. The cartels have unlimited money and resources, and there will always be people willing to compromise their integrity for the right price. What I hope is that we made it a little harder for them, made officials think twice before accepting bribes, made it clear that corruption can be exposed and prosecuted even when it's protected by people in authority. After Garza left, I spent a long time thinking about his words and about what the case had revealed about law enforcement in border communities. The truth was that policing the border presented unique challenges and temptations. The cartels had resources that dwarfed what law enforcement could deploy. They could offer money that represented years of salary to officers who were struggling financially. They could use threats and intimidation against officers who refused to cooperate. They operated in remote areas where supervision was limited and opportunities for misconduct were abundant. Under those conditions, it was perhaps inevitable that some officials would be corrupted, but that didn't make it acceptable or something to be tolerated. The months following the trials brought a steady stream of additional revelations about corruption and misconduct in border operations. Some of the information came from officials who'd been peripherally involved in the Hermosillo operation and decided to cooperate rather than face prosecution. Other information came from community members who'd been afraid to report what they'd witnessed, but now felt safer coming forward. Father Santos and the coalition documented dozens of additional cases of official misconduct, and while not all of them involved the kind of systematic corruption that Garza had exposed, they revealed a culture in some agencies where abuse and misconduct were tolerated or covered up. Pike and I found ourselves dealing with the aftermath of the case in ways we hadn't anticipated. Community members who'd previously been reluctant to interact with law enforcement began coming forward with information about crimes and suspicious activities. People who'd assumed that reporting problems to authorities would be pointless or dangerous started to believe that accountability was possible. At the same time, we faced hostility from some law enforcement officers who felt that the investigation had unfairly targeted their agencies and created an atmosphere of suspicion that made their jobs harder. Several officers I'd worked with for years stopped speaking to me, viewing my involvement in the Garza investigation as a betrayal of law enforcement solidarity. The tension between supporting fellow officers and holding them accountable when they violated the law was something I struggled with throughout the case and afterward. Law enforcement culture emphasizes loyalty and backing up your fellow officers, principles that serve important purposes in dangerous situations where officers need to trust that their colleagues will support them. But that same culture can become toxic when it's used to protect misconduct, when loyalty becomes code for covering up crimes, and when questioning the actions of fellow officers is treated as betrayal. The Garza case had forced many of us in southern Arizona law enforcement to confront those tensions and decide where our ultimate loyalties lay. May Hollister faced similar challenges within Border Patrol. Her willingness to investigate corruption within her own agency made her valuable to reform efforts, but also made her suspect among colleagues who viewed internal investigations with hostility. She told me during one of our conversations after the trials that her career trajectory had essentially been destroyed by her involvement in the case. While she'd received commendations from headquarters and recognition from reform advocates, she'd been effectively frozen out of advancement opportunities and found herself increasingly isolated within the agency. Some colleagues viewed her as a traitor who'd sided with critics of Border Patrol rather than defending the agency against unfair attacks. The ironic thing is that I was trying to protect the agency, Hollister said during one of our meetings to review ongoing investigations. Every corrupt officer who gets exposed damages the reputation of everyone who wears the uniform. Every case like this makes it harder for honest agents to do their jobs because it erodes public trust. The people who are angry at me for investigating corruption should be angry at the officers who were corrupt in the first place. They're the ones who betrayed the agency and made all of us look bad. But that's not how a lot of people see it. They think that keeping quiet about misconduct is loyalty, and that exposing it is betrayal. The strain of the case and its aftermath led Hollister to eventually transfer to a different sector, seeking a fresh start in an area where she wasn't known primarily for her role in exposing corruption. Before she left southern Arizona, we met one final time to discuss what we'd learned from the Garza investigation. Both of us agreed that, despite the professional costs and personal challenges, we'd done the right thing. The evidence had been too serious to ignore, and the corruption had been too systematic to address through anything other than thorough investigation and prosecution. Whether it made a lasting difference in how border security operations were conducted remained to be seen, but at minimum, we'd demonstrated that accountability was possible and that even well-protected corruption could be exposed. Father Santos and the Border Justice Coalition continued their advocacy work, using the Garza case as an example of problems they'd been documenting for years. The coalition expanded its documentation efforts and developed better relationships with media organizations and policymakers who could amplify their findings. Father Santos told me that the case had validated their work and given them credibility they'd previously lacked. When they reported problems with official conduct, people were more likely to take their concerns seriously rather than dismissing them as exaggerated complaints from immigration activists. For years, we were voices crying in the wilderness, Father Santos said during one of our regular meetings. We'd document abuse, we'd gather testimony, we'd compile evidence, and nothing would happen. Officials would deny our allegations or claim we were biased against law enforcement. The Garza case proved that we'd been right all along about corruption and misconduct. It proved that the problems we'd been documenting were real and serious. Now, when we bring concerns to authorities, they have to take us seriously because they know that ignoring evidence can lead to exactly the kind of scandal that the Hermosillo prosecution created. A year after the arrests, I drove out to the Aguirre Wash where we'd first found the abandoned patrol vehicle. The Ford Explorer had been removed as evidence and eventually sold at auction after the trials concluded. The wash looked exactly as it had before. A dry riverbed cutting through the desert, carrying water only during the brief intense storms of monsoon season and sitting empty the rest of the year. Standing there in the afternoon heat, I thought about everything that had emerged from finding that vehicle and following the evidence wherever it led. The case had exposed corruption that had been operating for years. It had resulted in convictions and prison sentences for officials who'd betrayed their oaths and compromised border security. It had validated the work of advocates who'd been documenting problems without recognition or support. It had demonstrated that accountability was possible even in systems where misconduct had been protected by powerful people. But it had also revealed how difficult it was to pursue such investigations, how much resistance came from within law enforcement culture, and how much personal cost was involved for everyone who participated in exposing the corruption. Thomas Garza had paid perhaps the highest price. He'd sacrificed his career, spent years conducting dangerous surveillance work, lived in fear for his life, and ultimately had to relocate to another state and start over in a new profession. The money he would have earned if he'd kept quiet and looked the other way would have been substantial. The career advancement he could have achieved by being a team player rather than a whistleblower would have given him security and status. Instead, he'd chosen to document corruption at enormous personal cost because he believed it was the right thing to do. Whether that choice had been worth it was something only Garza could answer, but I respected him for making it. Pike and I continued working in the Southern District, handling the same kinds of cases we'd always handled, but with a different perspective shaped by the Garza investigation. We were more skeptical of official narratives that didn't match the evidence. We were more willing to ask difficult questions about why certain enforcement efforts succeeded or failed. We were more alert to signs that smuggling operations might be receiving protection or inside information. The case had changed how we approached law enforcement work, making us more aware that the badge didn't automatically confer trustworthiness, and that sometimes the people we needed to investigate wore the same uniform we did. The convictions and prison sentences sent a message throughout border security agencies in Arizona and beyond. Officials who might have been tempted by cartel money knew that corruption could be exposed and prosecuted. The code of silence that had protected misconduct had been broken, at least temporarily, by officials like Garza and Hollister who'd been willing to report crimes despite the professional risks. Whether the deterrent effect would last was unclear. The financial incentives for corruption remained substantial, and the cartels continued to have enormous resources they could deploy to compromise officials. But at least for a while, the risks of getting caught had increased enough to make some officials think twice. I retired from the Pima County Sheriff's Office 3 years after the Garza case concluded. The investigation and its aftermath had been exhausting, both professionally and personally, and I'd begun to feel that I'd given enough years to law enforcement work. Pike took over as the senior deputy in the Southern District, and I had confidence that he'd continue the kind of thorough, honest policing that the community deserved. Before I left, I wrote a detailed case file about the Garza investigation, documenting not just the facts and evidence, but also the lessons learned about investigating corruption within law enforcement agencies. The case file included practical guidance about how to conduct such investigations without alerting subjects or compromising evidence. It discussed the importance of working with community organizations that might have information not available through official channels. It emphasized the need for extreme caution when determining who could be trusted with sensitive information about corruption investigations. Most importantly, it acknowledged the personal and professional costs that came with investigating fellow officers and the importance of supporting people who made the difficult choice to expose misconduct despite those costs. On my last day in the office, Pike and I drove out to the Buenos Aires Wildlife Refuge and hiked to the observation point where we'd found evidence of Garza's surveillance work. The location looked exactly as it had when we'd first visited it more than 3 years earlier. The rocks Garza had arranged for concealment were still in place. The fire ring he'd created was still visible in the dust. The landscape held no indication of the dramatic events that had unfolded here. The surveillance operation that had exposed systematic corruption, the hasty flight when that operation had been discovered, and the investigation that had ultimately brought justice. Standing there in the desert heat, looking out over the same landscape that Garza had observed night after night while documenting the Hermosillo operation, I felt a deep appreciation for what he'd accomplished and what it had cost him. He'd been one person working alone against a corrupt system protected by powerful people with access to unlimited resources. He'd gathered evidence meticulously, documented patterns patiently, and persisted despite knowing the enormous risks he was taking. When his surveillance had been discovered and he'd been forced to flee, he'd managed to preserve enough evidence that his investigation could continue through others. The dry riverbed below us looked peaceful in the afternoon sun, the white sand reflecting harsh light and creating shimmering heat waves above the surface. During monsoon season, this wash would transform into a raging torrent, carrying water from the mountains to the valley floor before disappearing back into the sand. The rest of the year, it sat empty and forgotten, just another anonymous feature in thousands of square miles of desert wilderness. But for a few weeks in the fall of 2021, this dry riverbed had been the center of an investigation that exposed corruption and demonstrated that accountability was still possible in border law enforcement. I don't know if the Garza case made a lasting difference in how border security operations are conducted, or whether the corruption we exposed was truly systematic, or just the actions of a few bad actors. I don't know if the officials we prosecuted were replaced by honest personnel or by new corrupt individuals who learned to be more careful about covering their tracks. I don't know if the increased scrutiny and accountability that followed the trials will persist, or if agencies will eventually return to the cultures that allowed misconduct to flourish in the first place. What I do know is that Thomas Garza demonstrated extraordinary courage in investigating corruption, despite enormous risks. Father Santos and Sofia Ruiz showed integrity in supporting that investigation, even when it put their organization in danger. May Hollister proved that it was possible to investigate misconduct within your own agency despite the professional costs. Pike and I followed the evidence wherever it led, even when that meant challenging powerful interests and facing hostility from fellow officers. Together, we accomplished something that many people had said was impossible: exposing protected corruption and holding corrupt officials accountable. The abandoned patrol vehicle in the Aguirre Wash turned out to be much more than a routine welfare check or a simple case of a lost officer. It was the beginning of an investigation that revealed systematic corruption, exposed officials who'd betrayed their oaths, and demonstrated that even in remote border regions where oversight was limited and misconduct was protected by powerful interests, accountability was still possible when people were willing to pursue justice regardless of personal cost. The desert keeps its secrets, and the dry riverbeds of southern Arizona have witnessed countless dramas over the centuries. Most of those stories disappear without trace, absorbed by the sand and forgotten by time. But sometimes, if you're willing to look carefully and follow the evidence patiently, those dry rivers reveal truths that need to be told, secrets that need to be exposed, and justice that needs to be served. The case that began with an abandoned vehicle in the Aguirre Wash was one of those times, and I'm grateful that I was there to see it through. My name is Cullen Brody, and I've been sheriff of Cochise County's southeastern district for 19 years. Before that, I spent a decade working as a deputy in various parts of Arizona, from the urban sprawl of Phoenix to the empty quarter along the Mexican border, where civilization thins out to nothing, and the landscape becomes a test of human endurance. Cochise County sits in the corner of Arizona where the Chiricahua Mountains rise from the desert floor like ancient fortresses, where ghost towns outnumber living communities, and where Interstate 10 cuts through landscapes so stark and beautiful it doesn't look entirely real. The southeastern district covers about 1,500 square miles of high desert, grassland, and mountain country. We've got maybe 8,000 permanent residents scattered across ranches, small towns, and communities that exist primarily because they're located at crossroads or near water sources that made settlement possible a century ago. The interstate brings through traffic, long-haul truckers, tourists heading to and from New Mexico, and the occasional criminal element using the highway system to move product or people across state lines. Most days, law enforcement work in this district involves routine traffic stops, domestic disputes, property crimes, and the endless task of covering vast distances with limited resources. November 3rd, 2022. Started cold and overcast. Unusual weather for southeastern Arizona, but not unprecedented for early November when the seasons shift and the high desert can experience dramatic temperature swings. I was at my office in the small town of Douglas, reviewing case files and trying to stay warm in a building whose heating system had been installed sometime during the Nixon administration and hadn't worked properly since. The office was utilitarian, standard government-issue furniture, filing cabinets stuffed with decades of paperwork, and maps covering the walls showing the roads, ranches, and landmarks that defined my jurisdiction. The call came in at 11:17 that morning from our dispatcher, a woman named Rita Vasquez, who'd been working the county communications center for longer than I'd been sheriff. Her voice carried an unusual note of confusion when she patched through to my direct line. "Sheriff Brody, we've got a strange one. Highway Patrol received a 911 call about 30 minutes ago from someone at a motel off Interstate 10. But when they tried to respond, they couldn't locate the place. They're asking if we can assist since it's technically in our jurisdiction." I pulled up a map on my computer and asked Rita for the specific location. She provided coordinates that placed the call somewhere near mile marker 352. An area I knew well because I'd patrolled it hundreds of times over the years. That stretch of Interstate 10 ran through particularly empty country, 20 miles of highway between the towns of Bowie to the west and San Simon to the east, with nothing but desert, mountains in the distance, and the occasional ranch access road breaking the monotony. I couldn't recall any motel in that area, active or abandoned, but it had been a few months since I'd driven that specific section of highway. "What was the nature of the emergency?" I asked, reaching for my jacket and keys. Rita consulted her notes, reading from the information Highway Patrol had forwarded. The caller reported a disturbance, possibly a theft or break-in at the Ash Road Motel. Said someone had been going through rooms and removing property. The call was brief, and the caller sounded elderly, possibly confused. Highway Patrol sent a unit, but they couldn't find any motel at the location. They drove that section of Interstate 3 times and saw nothing but empty desert. The name, Ash Road Motel, didn't ring any bells, and I'd been working this district long enough to know every business, active or closed, within 50 miles. I told Rita I'd drive out and investigate, and asked her to pull any records we had about motels or lodging facilities in that area. If there was an active business I didn't know about, that was concerning from a public safety standpoint. If someone was making false emergency calls, that was a different kind of problem that needed addressing. Either way, it warranted investigation. The drive to mile marker 352 took about 45 minutes through country that embodied everything people think of when they imagine the American Southwest. Vast, empty spaces punctuated by dramatic geological features, mountains rising abruptly from valley floors, and a sense of isolation that could be either liberating or oppressive depending on your perspective. The interstate was relatively quiet, just a few trucks and cars scattered across miles of highway. The weather remained overcast, with dark clouds building to the north and the smell of rain in the air, promising one of the rare storms that brought moisture to this part of Arizona. As I approached mile marker 352, I slowed down and began watching carefully for any sign of a motel or access road that might lead to one. The highway patrol officer had been right about there being nothing obvious. The interstate stretched straight and empty in both directions, with the desert spreading out on either side, broken only by creosote bushes, ocotillo, and the occasional mesquite. The mountains formed a distant backdrop, and the only visible structures were a few abandoned ranch buildings miles from the highway. I drove past the marker, continued for another 5 miles, then turned around and drove back slowly, scanning both sides of the road. On my second pass, I noticed something I'd missed the first time. About a quarter mile past mile marker 352, there was what looked like an old access road heading south from the interstate. The road was barely visible, little more than 2 faint tracks disappearing into the desert, and there was no sign or marker indicating where it led. I pulled onto the shoulder and examined the access road more carefully. The tracks showed recent use, tire marks in the dust suggesting that at least one vehicle had driven this way within the past few days. That was unusual enough in this remote area to warrant investigation. I radioed my location to dispatch and told Rita I was going to follow the access road and see where it led. The road was rough, clearly not maintained for regular traffic, winding through desert scrub for about half a mile before cresting a small rise. When I reached the top of that rise, I stopped the vehicle and stared in disbelief at what lay in the shallow valley below. There, sitting in the middle of nowhere with no other structures visible for miles, was a motel. The building was classic mid-century roadside architecture, a single-story L-shaped structure with maybe 20 rooms, painted white with turquoise trim that had faded to pale blue. A separate building that looked like it had been the office, and possibly a small restaurant, sat at the entrance to the parking area. The whole complex had the weathered appearance of a place that had been abandoned for decades, with broken windows, doors hanging open, and the general air of neglect that comes from years of exposure to harsh desert conditions. But what struck me most was that this place shouldn't exist. I'd been patrolling this district for nearly 30 years, and I'd never seen or heard of a motel in this location. I drove slowly down to the property and parked in what had been the main parking area. The pavement was cracked and broken, with desert plants growing through gaps in the asphalt. Trash and tumbleweeds had accumulated against the buildings, and everything had the stillness that comes with long abandonment. I got out of the vehicle and immediately noticed something that made my skin prickle. Despite the appearance of decades-long abandonment, the air smelled of cigarette smoke, recent cigarette smoke, as if someone had been smoking here within the past few minutes. I approached the office building carefully, one hand resting on my sidearm. The front door was standing open, hanging at an angle on broken hinges. Inside, the office looked like it had been frozen in time around the early 1970s. There was a check-in desk with an old cash register, a board on the wall with room keys hanging from numbered hooks, and furnishings that would have been modern when Nixon was president. Everything was covered in dust and debris, with evidence of animals nesting in corners and weather damage from the broken windows. But there were also signs of recent human presence. Footprints in the dust, disturbed areas where items had been moved, and that persistent smell of cigarette smoke. Behind the check-in desk, I found a guest ledger, the old-fashioned kind where names were written in by hand. The ledger was water-damaged and faded, but I could make out entries dating from the 1960s and early 1970s. Guests had checked in with names, addresses, and vehicle information, creating a record of travelers who'd stopped at this remote motel decades ago. The last entry appeared to be from June 1973, after which the pages were blank as if the motel had simply stopped operating at that point. I photographed several pages of the ledger with my phone, documenting what might be evidence if this turned out to be relevant to whatever had prompted the 911 call. I left the office and walked along the row of motel rooms. Most of the doors were open or missing entirely, revealing interiors that looked like abandoned stage sets. Beds with rotting mattresses, furniture that had collapsed from age and weather exposure, bathrooms where fixtures had been stripped out or had deteriorated beyond recognition. Room after room showed the same pattern of abandonment and decay. But as I progressed down the line of rooms, I noticed something increasingly disturbing. Several rooms contained file boxes, dozens of them, stacked against walls or sitting on beds and furniture. The boxes were relatively new, certainly not decades old like everything else in the motel. I carefully opened one and found it full of file folders containing what appeared to be accident reports. The documents were photocopies dating from various years in the 90s and 2000s, and they all involved traffic accidents on Interstate 10 in Cochise County. Each file contained a police report, photographs of accident scenes, and in some cases medical examiner reports for fatalities. I checked several more boxes and found the same pattern. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of documents related to traffic accidents, all organized by date and location. This discovery raised immediate questions about what was going on and who had brought these files here. Accident reports were public records, so possessing copies wasn't illegal, but the sheer volume suggested someone had been conducting extensive research or investigation. More concerning was the location. Why would someone store boxes of accident reports in an abandoned motel miles from the nearest town? The effort required to transport this many boxes to such a remote location suggested serious purpose behind whatever was being done here. I was examining the contents of a file box in what had been room 7 when I heard a vehicle approaching. I moved to the doorway and watched as an old Ford pickup truck came down the access road and pulled into the parking area. The truck looked like it dated from the 1980s, showing the wear of decades of hard use but still apparently functional. A man got out of the driver's seat, saw me standing by the motel room, and froze for a moment before slowly walking in my direction. The man appeared to be in his 70s, thin and weathered with the permanently sunburned complexion of someone who'd spent most of his life outdoors. He wore jeans, a faded work shirt, and a baseball cap that had seen better years. His expression was wary but not hostile. The look of someone who'd been caught doing something they probably shouldn't be doing but wasn't sure whether they were actually in trouble. "You must be the sheriff," he said when he was close enough to speak normally. "I figured someone would show up eventually after I called." I identified myself and asked for his name. He introduced himself as Elias Truitt, said he lived in Bowie, and had been maintaining the property for the past few years. I asked him to clarify what he meant by maintaining, since the property looked thoroughly abandoned. Truitt gestured around at the motel with a slight smile. "Well, maintaining might be an exaggeration. More like I check on the place periodically, make sure nobody's using it for purposes that might cause problems. The owner asked me to keep an eye on things, even though there's not much that can be done to preserve buildings that have been sitting empty for 50 years. The mention of an owner surprised me. I'd assumed the property was abandoned in the legal sense as well as the practical sense, probably tied up in some probate dispute or forgotten by heirs who'd moved away decades ago. Truitt saw my expression and nodded. "Yeah. Most people don't know the place still has an owner. Mrs. Verna Poe lives over in Wilcox. She inherited the motel from her parents who built it back in the 1950s and ran it until it closed in the early 70s. She's kept paying property taxes all these years, won't sell it even though it's worth nothing but the land." I asked Truitt about the 911 call and what had prompted it. He explained that he'd driven out to the property that morning to check on it, something he did every couple of months. When he'd arrived, he'd found evidence that someone had been in the rooms, moving boxes around and possibly removing some of them. That concerned him because Mrs. Poe had specifically asked him to make sure nobody disturbed the boxes. He'd called 911 to report what he thought might be theft, but then he'd realized he probably should have called the sheriff's office directly instead of emergency services. "What's in all these boxes?" I asked, gesturing toward room 7 and the files I'd been examining. Truett's expression became uncomfortable, and he hesitated before answering. "That's Mrs. Poe's business, Sheriff. She's been collecting those files for years, I think as part of some research project she's working on. She stores them here because she doesn't have room at her house and because she says the motel is somehow connected to what she's researching. I don't ask too many questions. She pays me a little money to check on the place, and that's the extent of my involvement." I explained that I needed to understand what was going on before I could determine whether any crime had been committed or whether there were any public safety concerns. Truett nodded reluctantly and suggested that I should probably talk to Mrs. Poe directly. He pulled out an old flip phone and made a call, speaking briefly to someone and then handing the phone to me. "Sheriff Brody. She wants to talk to you." The voice on the phone was elderly but sharp, with the precise diction of someone who'd been educated when grammar and articulation were considered important. "Sheriff Brody, I'm Verna Poe. Elias tells me you're at my property investigating the call he made. I apologize for any confusion. The motel has been in my family for 70 years, and I use it for storage related to research I've been conducting. If someone has been disturbing my files, I'd appreciate your help in determining who and why. But I want to be clear that I'm not making any formal complaints or requesting prosecution." I asked Mrs. Poe what kind of research required storing thousands of accident reports in an abandoned motel. There was a long pause before she answered, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that suggested this was a topic she didn't discuss lightly. "Sheriff, the Ash Road Motel has a history that most people don't know about. During the 23 years my parents operated it, from 1950 to 1973, there were over 300 fatal accidents on the stretch of Interstate 10 visible from the motel property. That's an unusually high number for any section of highway, high enough that some people began calling this area cursed or haunted. I've been trying to understand why so many people died on this particular stretch of road." The explanation didn't entirely make sense, and I said so. Even if there had been an unusual number of accidents in the area, I couldn't see how collecting reports about them and storing them in an abandoned motel would help explain anything. Mrs. Poe's response was measured and careful. "Sheriff, I'm 84 years old, and I've spent most of my life trying to answer a question that probably doesn't have a satisfying answer. My parents closed the motel in 1973 because they couldn't stand watching people die anymore. Every week, sometimes multiple times per week, they'd hear crashes, see smoke from burning vehicles, and have to call for ambulances that often arrived too late. It broke something in them, and eventually they just walked away from the business they'd built." She continued explaining that after her parents' death, she'd inherited the property and had become obsessed with understanding the pattern of accidents. She'd requested copies of every accident report from the Arizona Department of Transportation and various law enforcement agencies, building a comprehensive database of incidents that had occurred in the area. Her research had consumed decades, and while she'd never found a satisfying explanation for why that particular stretch of highway seemed prone to fatal accidents, she'd documented the phenomenon thoroughly enough that she believed someone eventually might be able to make sense of it. "The files you see in those rooms represent every serious accident that occurred within sight of the motel from 1950 to the present day," Mrs. Poe said. "Each box is organized chronologically, and each file contains everything I could gather about the incident: police reports, medical records when available, newspaper articles, photographs. I store them at the motel because that's where the history exists. That's where my parents spent 23 years watching people die for reasons they could never understand. I told Mrs. Poe that I'd like to speak with her in person and asked if she'd be willing to meet me at the motel. She agreed, saying she could drive over from Wilcox and be there within an hour. After hanging up, I handed the phone back to Truett and asked him to show me around the property while we waited. I wanted to understand the layout of the motel and get a sense of what might have attracted someone to come here and go through the files. Truett led me through the complex, explaining the history as we walked. The motel had been built in 1950, just a few years after Interstate 10 had been completed through this section of Arizona. At the time, there had been expectations that the highway would bring significant traffic through the area, and several businesses had been established to serve travelers. But the traffic never materialized at the levels people had hoped for, and most of the businesses eventually failed. The Ash Road Motel had survived longer than most, partly because the Poe family had been willing to work incredibly hard for modest returns, and partly because they'd developed a reputation for clean rooms and honest service. The problem was the accidents, Truett said, as we stood in the parking area looking toward the interstate visible in the distance. From the very beginning, there were way too many crashes on this stretch of highway. Bad ones, too. Multi-vehicle pile-ups, single-car accidents where people went off the road at high speed and hit rocks or rolled multiple times. Mrs. Poe told me her father kept a log of every accident they witnessed from the motel, and by the time they closed the place, he'd documented over 300 fatalities. That's an average of more than one per month for 23 years. I asked whether there were any obvious reasons for the high accident rate. Highway conditions, sharp curves, areas where visibility was limited. Anything that might explain why this particular section of road would be more dangerous than others. Truett shook his head. That's what makes it so strange. If you look at the highway from here, it's straight and flat with good visibility in both directions. The road surface is good. There are no blind curves or dangerous intersections. By all rights, this should be one of the safest stretches of Interstate 10 in Arizona. But for some reason, people kept crashing here, and a lot of them died. Verna Poe arrived at the motel exactly 1 hour after our phone conversation, driving a newer model sedan that looked incongruous against the backdrop of the deteriorating buildings. She was a small woman, probably no more than 5 feet tall, with white hair pulled back in a neat bun and the kind of erect posture that suggested someone who'd maintained personal standards throughout a long life. She wore a cardigan sweater over a simple dress, sensible shoes, and carried a leather handbag that looked like it might be older than I was. Her eyes, behind wire-rimmed glasses, were sharp and assessing as she looked at me, standing next to Truett in the parking area. "Sheriff Brody, thank you for taking the time to investigate Elias's call," she said, extending a hand that was small but surprisingly strong. "I apologize if we've wasted your time. The situation is complicated, and I'm not sure I explained it adequately on the phone." Her voice carried the same precise quality I'd noticed during our call, each word carefully articulated with the cadence of someone from a generation that valued clear communication. There was also a weariness underlying her words, the exhaustion of someone who'd been carrying a heavy burden for a very long time. I assured her that investigating unusual situations was part of my job, and that I was genuinely curious about what she'd been researching, and why someone might have been disturbing her files. Mrs. Poe nodded and gestured toward the motel office. "Perhaps we could talk inside, away from the wind. I'd like to show you some things that might help explain why this place has consumed so much of my life." We walked to the office building, and despite the structure's obvious deterioration, Mrs. Poe moved through it with the familiarity of someone who'd spent considerable time here. She led us to what had been a back room, probably used for storage or as living quarters for the owners, where she'd set up a makeshift workspace. The workspace consisted of a folding table, several camping chairs, and a battery-powered lamp. On the table was a large map of the area surrounding the motel, with the section of Interstate 10 clearly marked and covered with colored pins. Each pin represented an accident, Mrs. Poe explained, with different colors indicating severity. Red pins for fatalities, yellow for serious injuries, blue for property damage only. The map was covered with hundreds of pins, creating a dense cluster along the highway visible from the motel property. The visual representation was striking and disturbing, showing just how concentrated the accidents had been in this specific area. "This is what I've been trying to understand for 40 years, Mrs. Poe said, pointing to the map. Why would this particular stretch of highway have such an extraordinarily high accident rate? I've consulted with traffic engineers, accident reconstruction specialists, even a psychologist who studies driver behavior. No one has been able to give me a satisfactory explanation. The highway design is standard. The road conditions are typical for the region. The traffic volume doesn't explain the accident frequency. And yet, people kept crashing here, year after year, decade after decade." She pulled out a 3-ring binder containing graphs and statistical analyses. The data she'd compiled was extensive and methodical, showing accident rates per mile for various sections of Interstate 10 across Arizona. The section visible from the Ash Road Motel showed an accident rate nearly 5 times higher than the state average and significantly higher than any other comparable stretch of highway. The pattern held consistent across decades, even as vehicle safety improved and highway design standards evolved. Whatever was causing the elevated accident rate, it had persisted through changes in technology, traffic patterns, and enforcement practices. I asked Mrs. Poe to walk me through the history of the motel and explain how her parents had dealt with witnessing so many accidents. She sat down in one of the camping chairs, and her expression became distant as she accessed memories that were clearly painful even decades later. "My parents built this motel with their life savings in 1950. My father had worked construction most of his life, and my mother had been a school teacher. They'd saved carefully and invested everything in this property because they believed the new interstate would bring prosperity to the region. For the first few years, business was decent enough to support them, though never as good as they'd hoped." The accidents had started almost immediately after the motel opened. In the first month of operation, there had been 3 fatal crashes on the section of highway visible from the property. Mrs. Poe's father had kept detailed records, documenting each accident he witnessed or learned about from authorities who responded to the scenes. At first, he thought it was just coincidence, or perhaps an unusually bad period that would normalize over time. But the accidents continued, with disturbing regularity. Multiple incidents per month that ranged from minor collisions to catastrophic multi-vehicle crashes. "My parents tried everything they could think of to help," Mrs. Poe continued, her voice taking on a tone that mixed pride with sadness. "They lobbied the state highway department to improve signage, add more lighting, reduce speed limits. They offered their parking lot as a rest area where tired drivers could pull off and sleep. My father even painted warning signs and placed them along the access road, trying to alert drivers that this section of highway was dangerous. Nothing made any difference. The accidents kept happening. The psychological toll on her parents had been severe and progressive. They'd been among the first responders to many accidents, rushing out with first aid supplies or fire extinguishers, often arriving at crash scenes before emergency services could reach the remote location. They'd witnessed death and suffering on a regular basis, seen people trapped in burning vehicles, held dying travelers who'd been conscious enough to know they weren't going to survive. After several years, both parents had developed what would now probably be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though in the 1960s there hadn't been much understanding or treatment available for such conditions. My mother started having nightmares about the crashes, Mrs. Poe said quietly. She'd wake up screaming, convinced she could hear tires screeching and metal crashing even though nothing was happening. My father became obsessive about his accident log, updating it constantly, adding details about weather conditions, time of day, types of vehicles involved. He was convinced that if he could just collect enough data, he'd find the pattern that would explain everything. But the pattern never became clear, and the accidents never stopped. By the early 1970s, her parents had reached a breaking point. The combination of financial struggles, the motel never generated the income they'd hoped for, and the psychological burden of witnessing so many deaths had become unbearable. In June 1973, after a particularly horrific accident involving a family with 3 children, all of whom died when their station wagon went off the road and rolled multiple times, Mrs. Poe's parents had simply closed the motel and walked away. They'd locked the doors, turned off the utilities, and moved to Wilcox, where they'd lived quietly until their deaths in the late 80s. They'd never spoken much about the motel years, treating that period of their lives as something too painful to revisit. When I inherited the property, I found my father's accident logs in the office. Mrs. Poe explained, 23 years of meticulous documentation, every crash he'd witnessed or learned about, all recorded in his careful handwriting. Reading those logs, seeing the accumulation of death and suffering, I understood why they'd never wanted to talk about this place. But I also felt compelled to continue what my father had started, to try to understand why this happened. I suppose part of me hoped that if I could explain it, I could somehow retroactively ease the burden my parents had carried. That obsession had led to decades of research. Mrs. Poe had requested accident reports from state and county archives, filed Freedom of Information requests with various agencies, and compiled the extensive database now stored in boxes throughout the motel rooms. She'd corresponded with traffic safety experts, analyzed weather patterns, studied the geology and geography of the area, and explored every possible explanation for the elevated accident rate. She'd investigated whether there might be something about the highway alignment that created optical illusions, or whether electromagnetic anomalies from nearby mineral deposits might affect vehicle electronics. I've spent 40 years and a considerable amount of money investigating this question, Mrs. Poe said, with a slight, sad smile. My children think I'm obsessed, and they're probably right. But I need to understand why this stretch of road killed so many people, why my parents had to witness all that suffering, why this place exists at all when it brought nothing but pain to everyone connected with it. I asked her about the current status of accident rates in the area, whether the pattern had continued after the motel closed. Mrs. Poe pulled out another set of documents showing accident statistics from 1973 to the present. The data told an interesting story. After the motel closed and her parents moved away, the accident rate had declined significantly, dropping to levels more consistent with other comparable sections of highway. There were still accidents, of course, but the frequency had decreased dramatically. By the 90s, the section of Interstate 10 near the abandoned motel was statistically average in terms of safety. That's one of the things that makes this so maddening, Mrs. Poe said, pointing to the graphs. If the accidents had continued at the same rate after my parents left, I could at least point to specific highway conditions or geographic factors as causes, but the rate dropped dramatically once they were gone, which suggests, I don't know what it suggests, that their presence somehow contributed to the accidents. That's absurd, but the correlation is undeniable. Truitt had been listening quietly, but now he spoke up. Mrs. Poe, you should tell the sheriff about the rooms, about what you found when you started organizing the files. The old woman's expression became uncomfortable, and she hesitated before responding. I'm not sure that's relevant to why the sheriff is here. The files have been disturbed and we wanted to report it. The other matters are probably not something law enforcement needs to concern themselves with. I pressed her gently, explaining that understanding the full context might help me determine whether there were legitimate concerns about the property or the files. After a long pause, Mrs. Poe stood and gestured for me to follow her. We walked out of the office and down the row of motel rooms, passing the doors standing open or hanging from broken hinges, until we reached a room near the end of the building. Room 14, according to the faded number still visible on the door frame. Unlike the other rooms I'd looked into, room 14's door was closed and appeared to be in better condition than the others. Mrs. Poe pulled a key from her handbag and unlocked the door, pushing it open to reveal an interior that was startlingly different from what I'd seen elsewhere in the motel. This room had been maintained, cleaned recently, and set up almost as a shrine or memorial. The walls were covered with photographs, hundreds of them, showing accident scenes, victims, memorial services. In the center of the room sat the bed, and on the bed were personal items, clothing, jewelry, photographs, letters, all carefully arranged and organized. "These are items I've collected from accident sites over the years," Mrs. Poe said quietly. "Things that were left behind when vehicles were towed away. Personal effects that were never claimed by families. Memorial items that people left at crash sites and that were eventually discarded or removed by highway maintenance crews. I couldn't stand the thought of these things just disappearing, being thrown away as if the people they belonged to had never existed. So I've been preserving them, keeping them here." The sight was deeply unsettling. Not because there was anything overtly disturbing about the objects themselves, but because of what they represented. This was a collection of memories from hundreds of deaths. Personal items that had belonged to people who'd died violently on the highway visible from this motel. The accumulation of so much loss in one place created an atmosphere that was oppressive and melancholic. I understood why Mrs. Poe's children might think she was obsessed. This level of engagement with death and tragedy went beyond research into something more personal and consuming. "I know how this looks," Mrs. Poe said, reading my expression. "I know it seems morbid, perhaps unhealthy. But these people died here, in this place, and most of them have been forgotten by everyone except the families who lost them. Someone should remember. Someone should acknowledge that their lives mattered and that their deaths meant something. My parents witnessed so many of these deaths, and this is my way of honoring both the victims and my parents' suffering." I asked whether she'd been to the motel recently, whether she might have been the person Truett had seen disturbing the files. She shook her head firmly. "I haven't been out here in several months. I usually come once or twice a year to add new files to the collection or to spend time in room 14. But I haven't made any recent visits. That's why Elias's call concerned me. If someone else has been here going through the files, I need to know who and why. These records represent decades of work, and some of them contain personal information that shouldn't be widely distributed." We walked back to the parking area, and I asked Truett to describe exactly what he'd found when he arrived that morning. He explained that several of the file boxes in room 7 had been moved, stacked differently than they'd been on his previous visit. Some boxes appeared to have been opened and their contents disturbed, with files pulled out and not returned in the proper order. Most significantly, he thought at least 2 boxes might be missing entirely, though he couldn't be certain since he didn't keep detailed inventory of the storage. "What concerned me most was finding this in room 9, Truett said, pulling a small object from his jacket pocket and handing it to me. It was a digital camera, relatively recent model, with a memory card still installed. Someone left this behind, or dropped it, or maybe intended to come back for it. I thought you might be able to use it to figure out who's been here." I examined the camera carefully. It was a standard consumer model, a few years old but still functional. The battery was dead, but that wouldn't be a problem once I got it back to the office and found a charger. If there were photos on the memory card, they might tell us who'd been at the motel and what they'd been photographing. I bagged the camera as evidence and made notes about where it had been found. This was starting to look like it might be more than just trespassing or curiosity. Someone had been conducting their own investigation of the motel and the accident files, and they'd been systematic enough about it to bring equipment and spend considerable time going through the records. Mrs. Poe looked troubled by the discovery of the camera. "Sheriff, I need to be honest with you about something. Over the years, I've had occasional contact from people who are interested in the motel's history. Researchers, authors writing about unusual phenomena, even people who claim to investigate paranormal activity. I've always refused to cooperate with them because I don't want the motel to become some kind of curiosity or tourist attraction. The deaths that occurred here were real, and the people who died deserve respect, not to be turned into entertainment or fodder for sensationalist stories." She explained that within certain communities, people who studied anomalies, unusual death patterns, or purportedly haunted locations. The Ash Road Motel had a reputation. There were online forums and websites that discussed the location, sharing theories about why the accident rate had been so high and speculating about supernatural causes. Mrs. Poe had done her best to keep the exact location secret, never publicly confirming the motel's name or providing directions to the property. But information had apparently leaked out over the years, and she'd occasionally found evidence that people had visited the site despite the remote location and lack of obvious access. "If someone from one of those communities has found the motel and is going through my files, that's deeply concerning," Mrs. Poe said. "Not just because of privacy issues with the accident reports, but because I don't want this place to become a destination for people who treat death and tragedy as entertainment. My parents suffered enough watching people die here. I won't allow their memory or the memories of the accident victims to be exploited." I assured Mrs. Poe that I'd investigate who'd been at the motel and what their intentions were. In the meantime, I suggested she consider whether storing sensitive files in an abandoned, unsecured building in a remote location was prudent. She acknowledged the concern but said she couldn't imagine storing the files anywhere else. "This is where the history exists, Sheriff. The accidents happened here, my parents witnessed them from this property, and the records belong here. I know that might not make logical sense, but it's important to me that the documentation remains connected to the place." Before leaving, I took detailed photographs of the motel complex, documenting the condition of the buildings and the layout of the property. I also photographed the map in Mrs. Poe's workspace and several pages of the statistical analyses she'd compiled. If this turned out to be part of a larger investigation, or if there were legal issues around the property or files, having thorough documentation would be valuable. Mrs. Poe gave me her contact information and made me promise to let her know what I found on the camera. The drive back to Douglas gave me time to think about what I'd encountered at the Ash Road Motel. On the surface, it was a straightforward case of possible trespassing and minor theft. Someone had entered an abandoned property and gone through stored materials, possibly removing some files. That was technically illegal, but it wasn't the kind of crime that typically warranted extensive investigation. What made the situation unusual was the context. The history of the motel. The obsessive research Mrs. Poe had been conducting for decades, and the disturbing collection of memorial items in room 14. There was also the question of why the motel seemed to have been forgotten by almost everyone except Mrs. Poe and now Truitt. I'd been working in this district for nearly 30 years, and I'd never heard of the Ash Road Motel. Highway patrol officers who regularly drove that section of Interstate 10 hadn't been able to locate it even with specific coordinates. Yet the property clearly existed. It was substantial enough that it should be memorable, and it had a documented history spanning more than 2 decades of operation. How does a motel that witnessed hundreds of fatal accidents simply disappear from collective memory? Back at the office, I plugged the camera into a charger and waited for it to power up. While it charged, I ran searches in county records and state databases for information about the Ash Road Motel. What I found was limited and puzzling. Property records showed the Poe family owning the land since 1950, with tax payments current and no liens or legal issues. But there were no business licenses on file for a motel operation, no records of the property ever being commercially zoned, and no documentation of utilities being connected to the location. It was as if the motel had existed but hadn't left any bureaucratic trace. State tourism records from the 1950s through 1970s made no mention of the motel, even though they documented other lodging facilities in the region. Highway Department records showed no accidents clusters in the area Mrs. Poe had identified, though their historical data was incomplete and might not have captured all incidents. I contacted the Arizona Department of Transportation and requested accident statistics for Interstate 10 near mile marker 352 from 1950 to the present. The representative I spoke with promised to compile the data, but warned it might take several days since historical records weren't fully digitized. When the camera finally powered up, I connected it to my computer and accessed the memory card. There were 73 photographs stored on the card, all taken at the Ash Road Motel within the past week based on the file timestamps. I began reviewing the images systematically, and what I saw made the situation significantly more complicated and concerning. The first photographs on the camera were exterior shots of the motel complex, taken from various angles and distances. The photographer had been methodical, documenting the buildings from the parking area, from the access road, and from positions around the property perimeter. These images showed the motel in afternoon light, with long shadows stretching across the cracked pavement and the desert landscape visible in every direction. Nothing unusual or particularly revealing, just standard documentation of an abandoned property. The next series of photographs showed the motel office interior, with particular focus on the check-in desk, the keyboard, and the guest ledger I'd examined earlier. The photographer had taken close-up shots of specific pages in the ledger, focusing on entries from 1972 and early 1973, the final months of the motel's operation. I zoomed in on these images and could make out names and details that I hadn't noticed during my own cursory examination. Several guests had checked in multiple times over the course of those final months, their names appearing repeatedly in the ledger with dates that suggested they'd been staying at the motel for extended periods. More photographs documented the individual motel rooms, showing the deteriorated interiors and the file boxes Mrs. Poe had been storing throughout the complex. The photographer had opened several boxes and photographed specific accident reports, focusing on incidents from particular time periods. I noticed that most of the photographed reports dated from 1972 to 1973, the same period emphasized in the ledger documentation. The photographer was clearly interested in the motel's final months of operation, suggesting they'd been conducting research with a specific focus rather than general curiosity about the location. The photographs that made me most uneasy came near the end of the sequence. These showed room 14, Mrs. Poe's memorial room, in disturbing detail. The photographer had documented every wall, every item on the bed, every photograph and personal effect that had been collected from accident sites over the decades. They'd taken close-ups of specific items, jewelry, clothing, letters, creating a comprehensive record of the memorial collection. Some photographs showed the photographer's hand holding items up to the camera, examining them closely, suggesting a level of engagement with the materials that went beyond simple documentation. but it was the final photographs on the memory card that transformed my understanding of the situation from unusual to genuinely disturbing. These images, taken at night based on the flash illumination and darkness visible through windows, showed something I hadn't seen during my daytime visit. In several rooms where file boxes were stored, the photographs captured what appeared to be additional materials that hadn't been visible or present when Truett and I had examined those same rooms hours earlier. Papers spread across beds and floors, photographs taped to walls, handwritten notes and diagrams covering surfaces. I enlarged these nighttime images on my computer screen, trying to understand what I was looking at. The materials appeared to be related to the accident files, but they'd been arranged in patterns that suggested someone was trying to connect specific incidents or identify relationships between them. One photograph showed a wall covered with accident reports arranged in a grid pattern, with red lines drawn between certain reports as if mapping connections. Another image captured what looked like a timeline, with dates and brief descriptions written on pieces of paper and arranged chronologically across a bed. Most unsettling was a photograph taken inside room 14 at night. Unlike the earlier daytime images of the memorial room, this nighttime shot showed the space transformed. All the personal items from the bed had been arranged on the floor in what looked like a deliberate pattern, forming shapes or symbols I couldn't immediately interpret. Photographs from the walls had been taken down and spread across the bed, apparently organized according to some system. The overall impression was of someone conducting an intensive investigation, or perhaps some kind of ritual using the materials Mrs. Poe had collected. The timestamp on these nighttime photographs showed they'd been taken 2 nights earlier, around 11 p.m. That meant someone had spent hours at the abandoned motel after dark, working by flashlight or battery-powered lamps, arranging materials and documenting their research or whatever they were doing. The level of commitment suggested this wasn't casual trespassing or simple curiosity. Someone was deeply invested in understanding something about the Ash Road Motel, and they'd been willing to spend considerable time and effort in pursuit of that understanding. I called Truett and described what I'd found on the camera. He listened quietly and then said something that made the situation even more complex. "Sheriff, I should probably tell you that I've found evidence of people visiting the motel before. Usually just trash or signs that someone was there briefly. Probably curiosity seekers who heard stories and wanted to see the place. But about 6 months ago, I found something different. Someone had been staying in one of the rooms, not just visiting but actually living there for a period of time. They'd brought in a cot, supplies, equipment. When I reported it to Mrs. Poe, she asked me to document it, but not to file any official complaints. I asked why Mrs. Poe wouldn't want trespassing reported, particularly if someone had been living on her property. Truett's response revealed another layer to the story. She said that sometimes people who are drawn to places like the motel are looking for something, trying to understand something about death or loss, or questions that don't have easy answers. She said that as long as they weren't damaging the property or disturbing the files, she didn't mind if they spent time there. She said her parents had welcomed travelers for 23 years, and in some way, the motel was still serving that purpose. This explanation aligned with the impression I'd formed of Mrs. Poe during our conversation. She wasn't simply researching accident statistics out of academic interest. She was engaged with profound questions about death, suffering, and the search for meaning in tragedy. If others were drawn to the motel for similar reasons, she apparently saw that as a kind of validation of her own decades-long obsession. The motel had become a place where people confronted mortality and sought answers to questions that probably didn't have satisfactory resolutions. I spent the rest of that afternoon and evening analyzing the photographs and trying to understand what story they told. The photographer had been systematic and purposeful, documenting specific materials with clear interest in the motel's final months of operation. The arrangement of accident reports and creation of connection diagrams suggested they were looking for patterns or relationships between incidents. The engagement with materials in room 14 indicated interest in the personal dimensions of the tragedies, not just the statistical or analytical aspects that Mrs. Poe's research emphasized. The next morning, I drove back to the Ash Road Motel, this time arriving around 10 a.m. to conduct a more thorough investigation. I wanted to see if any of the materials visible in the nighttime photographs were still present, and I wanted to examine room 14 more carefully to see if the arrangement of items had been disturbed, as those photographs suggested. The drive out to the property felt different this time, perhaps because I was approaching it with more knowledge about its history and with specific investigative purposes rather than responding to an uncertain situation. The motel looked exactly as it had during my previous visit, deteriorating buildings sitting in silent isolation under a sky that promised more of the unusual November weather that had characterized the past few days. I parked in the same location and began a systematic search of the rooms, starting with those that had contained the arranged materials in the nighttime photographs. What I found was puzzling and slightly unnerving. The rooms looked exactly as they had during my first visit, with file boxes stacked and nothing arranged on beds or walls. If someone had spent hours organizing accident reports into patterns 2 nights earlier, they'd subsequently returned everything to its original state. Room 14 presented a similar situation. All the personal items were arranged on the bed exactly as they'd been when Mrs. Poe had shown me the memorial collection. The photographs were on the walls in their previous positions. There was no indication that anything had been moved or disturbed. Either the nighttime photographs on the camera had documented a temporary arrangement that had been carefully restored, or something stranger was happening that I didn't yet understand. I spent more than an hour examining room 14, trying to understand Mrs. Poe's collection and what it revealed about her state of mind. The personal effects she'd gathered represented hundreds of individual tragedies, each item connected to a person who had died violently on the highway visible from this motel. Some items were mundane: clothing, watches, everyday objects that could have belonged to anyone. Others were more personal and poignant: wedding rings, letters, photographs of children, things that spoke to the lives that had been interrupted by sudden death. What struck me most was the care with which everything had been arranged. Mrs. Poe had organized the items by type and date, creating a catalog of loss that was both comprehensive and respectful. Each item had a small handwritten label providing context: the date of the accident, the victim's name if known, and sometimes brief details about the circumstances. The collection wasn't ghoulish or exploitative. It was a genuine attempt to preserve the memory of people who might otherwise be completely forgotten, to acknowledge that their lives and deaths had mattered to someone. As I was photographing the collection for my case file, I noticed something that hadn't been visible during my first quick look at the room. Behind some of the items on the bed, partially hidden by a folded jacket, was a small notebook. I carefully moved the jacket aside and examined the notebook without touching it initially. It appeared to be recent, certainly not decades old like most of the other materials in the room. The cover was unmarked, and through the gap where it lay partially open, I could see handwritten text. Using gloves, I picked up the notebook and began reading. The handwriting was neat and precise, and the content made it immediately clear that this wasn't something Mrs. Poe had left behind. The writer was documenting visits to the motel, recording observations about the property, and making notes about the accident files. The entries were dated, starting about 3 weeks earlier, and they chronicled a progression of research and investigation that aligned with the systematic approach visible in the photographs from the camera. The early entries focused on practical matters: gaining access to the property, locating the file storage rooms, beginning to review the accident reports. The writer described finding Mrs. Poe's workspace in the office building and studying her maps and statistical analyses. They noted the concentration of accidents during the motel's operational period and the dramatic decline after 1973. These observations matched what Mrs. Poe had explained to me, suggesting the notebook's author had been conducting similar research and reaching similar conclusions. Later entries became more speculative and philosophical. The writer discussed theories about why the accident rate had been so high, considering and dismissing various conventional explanations like highway design, weather patterns, or driver behavior. They noted the statistical improbability of such concentrated tragedy and questioned whether there might be factors operating that conventional analysis couldn't capture. The tone suggested someone trained in research methods but willing to consider unconventional explanations when conventional ones proved inadequate. The most recent entries, written just days before I'd found the camera, took on a different character. The writer described spending nights at the motel, observing the property after dark, and experiencing phenomena that were difficult to articulate. They wrote about hearing sounds that might have been highway traffic or might have been something else, about seeing lights moving across the desert that didn't correspond to vehicles on the distant interstate, about feeling presences in certain rooms that suggested the motel retained some imprint of the deaths that had occurred nearby. One entry in particular stood out for its detailed description of an experience in room 14. The writer described arranging the personal items in specific patterns, attempting to create some kind of connection with the people they'd belonged to. They wrote about feeling overwhelming sadness and sensing the accumulated grief that Mrs. Poe's collection represented. Most significantly, they claimed to have experienced what they described as communications, impressions or feelings that seemed to come from outside their own thoughts, conveying messages about the accidents and the people who died. The final entry in the notebook was dated 2 days earlier, the same night the photographs had been taken. It was brief and carried a tone of urgency very different from the measured observations in earlier entries. I understand now why the accidents happened. It wasn't the highway or the motel or any physical factor. It was attention. The Poes watched, documented, focused on death happening in this place, and somehow that attention drew more death. Their observation created a feedback loop that concentrated tragedy. When they left and stopped watching, the pattern broke. But I've been watching now, studying the deaths, giving them attention again, and I can feel it starting to return. The motel wants witnesses. It needs observers. I have to leave before I become part of what I've been studying. I read that final entry several times, trying to understand what the writer meant and what implications it might have for the investigation. The suggestion that observation itself could somehow attract or cause accidents was clearly irrational, but the writer's conviction came through powerfully in their urgent prose. They'd convinced themselves that researching the motel and studying the accident files had somehow activated whatever process had caused the original clustering of tragedies. Whether that belief had any basis in reality, or was simply the product of spending too many hours alone in an abandoned building thinking about death, was unclear. I searched the rest of the motel systematically, looking for any other materials the photographer might have left behind, or any indication of who they were. In room 9, where Truitt had found the camera, I discovered a small duffel bag tucked into a closet. The bag contained personal items that provided some identification. There was a wallet with a driver's license belonging to someone named Marcus Ashford, a resident of Tucson. The license photo showed a man in his 30s with the serious expression typical of DMV photography. Also in the bag were protein bars, water bottles, a flashlight, and a portable battery pack for charging electronic devices. Most revealing was a laptop computer, password protected, but potentially containing information about Ashford's research and intentions. I bagged everything as evidence and made notes about the discovery location. Now I had a name and could potentially track down whoever had been conducting this unauthorized investigation. Whether they'd committed any prosecutable crime was debatable. Trespassing certainly, possibly theft if they'd taken any of Mrs. Poe's files, but the more interesting question was what they'd discovered, and whether their final notebook entry represented genuine insight or the kind of psychological deterioration that could come from obsessive focus on death and tragedy. Back at my office, I ran Marcus Ashford through law enforcement databases and found a limited but informative record. He was 34 years old, held a doctorate in sociology from the University of Arizona, and had no criminal history beyond a couple of traffic violations. His social media presence was minimal, but what existed suggested someone interested in anomalous phenomena, unexplained patterns in social data, and the intersection of collective belief and objective reality. He'd published several academic papers on topics like how communities respond to concentrated tragedies, and whether observation bias could affect the interpretation of statistical patterns. I called the phone number associated with Ashford's driver's license and reached a voicemail with a professional greeting identifying him as Dr. Ashford and providing contact information for the University of Arizona Sociology Department. I left a message identifying myself and asking him to call me back regarding an investigation in Cochise County. I didn't mention the motel specifically, wanting to see how he'd respond to a general inquiry from law enforcement. While waiting for Ashford to return my call, I contacted Mrs. Poe and updated her on what I'd found. She listened quietly to my description of the photographs, the notebook, and the materials I'd recovered. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment before responding. "Sheriff, what this man wrote in his final entry, about attention and observation creating a pattern that attracts tragedy, my father believed something similar. He never articulated it the way this researcher did, but he felt that by documenting the accident so carefully, by focusing so much attention on death, he might somehow be contributing to it. That's part of why he walked away. He thought that if he stopped watching, stopped recording, the deaths might stop too." She explained that her father's belief had been based more on guilt and psychological exhaustion than on any rational theory. He'd felt responsible for the accidents in some irrational way, as if his presence as a witness somehow made them more likely to occur. Her mother had tried to convince him that his feelings were just the product of trauma and survivor's guilt. But he'd never been able to shake the conviction that he should have done something differently, though he could never articulate what that something might have been. When the accident rate dropped after they left, my father took that as confirmation of his fears, Mrs. Poe said. He believed his departure had saved lives, that by removing his attention from the highway, he'd broken whatever pattern had been operating. My mother thought the decline was just random statistical variation, or perhaps changes in highway safety that happened to coincide with their leaving. They never resolved that disagreement, and it haunted him for the rest of his life. I asked whether Mrs. Poe believed there was any validity to the idea that observation could influence accident rates. Her answer was careful and thoughtful. "Sheriff, I've spent 40 years studying this question, and I still don't know what to believe. The statistical correlation between the motel's operation and the elevated accident rate is undeniable, but correlation isn't causation, and I can't construct any rational mechanism by which my parents' presence or attention would affect driver behavior on a highway hundreds of yards away. Yet the pattern exists, and I haven't found any conventional explanation that accounts for it adequately." She continued, saying that her research had led her to consider factors that weren't typically included in traffic safety analysis. The psychology of place, for instance. How certain locations acquire reputations that might unconsciously affect people's behavior. Or the possibility of statistical clustering that appeared meaningful but was actually random, humans being pattern-seeking creatures who found significance in arrangements that were purely coincidental. Or perhaps there were genuine anomalies in certain locations, factors not yet understood by conventional science, that could influence events in ways that seemed impossible from our current perspective. What concerns me most, Mrs. Poe said, is that this researcher reached the same conclusion my father did, that observation somehow feeds the pattern. If he's right, then my own research might be perpetuating exactly what I've been trying to understand. By collecting all these accident reports, by maintaining the memorial in room 14, by spending so much time focused on death at this location, I might be creating the conditions for the pattern to return. That's a terrifying thought, Sheriff, and I'm not sure what to do with it. Marcus Ashford called me back 3 hours later, and his voice carried the cautious tone of someone who'd been expecting law enforcement contact, but wasn't sure what it would involve. I identified myself and explained that I was investigating activities at a property in Cochise County where belongings matching his identification had been found. I didn't mention the motel by name initially, wanting to see how he'd respond. There was a long pause before Ashford spoke, and when he did, his words came carefully measured as if he were choosing each one with precision. "Sheriff Brody, I assume you're calling about the Ash Road Motel. I've been conducting research there, and I apologize if I've created any problems. I should have sought permission from the property owner before accessing the site, but I was concerned that requesting formal permission would result in denial, and the research I'm conducting is important enough that I made the decision to proceed without authorization. I recognize that was wrong, and I'm prepared to face whatever consequences are appropriate." His immediate acknowledgement and apparent willingness to accept responsibility suggested someone who'd thought through the implications of his actions and had decided the research justified the risk. I asked him to explain what kind of research warranted trespassing on private property and spending nights alone in an abandoned building miles from civilization. Ashford's response revealed a depth of commitment and intellectual engagement that went beyond what I'd expected from someone I'd initially assumed was just another curiosity seeker drawn to a location with an unusual history. "Sheriff, my academic work focuses on what I call observational anomalies, situations where the act of watching or measuring appears to influence the phenomenon being observed. This is well established in quantum physics, but I've been investigating whether similar principles might operate at larger scales in social and physical systems. The Ash Road Motel represents a unique opportunity to study such a phenomenon because it has a documented history of correlation between sustained observation and a statistical anomaly that disappeared when observation ceased." He explained that he'd learned about the motel through academic networks, researchers who studied unexplained patterns in accident data, crime statistics, and other phenomena that didn't fit conventional explanations. The motel's history had been discussed in papers and conferences as an example of anomalous clustering, events concentrating in ways that probability couldn't adequately explain. Most researchers had dismissed it as statistical artifact or data collection error, but Ashford had been intrigued by the correlation between the motel's operation and the elevated accident rate. What made it compelling from a research perspective was the temporal boundary, Ashford said. The pattern started when the Poes opened the motel and began documenting accidents. It continued throughout the 23 years they operated the business and maintained detailed records. Then it stopped abruptly when they closed the motel and stopped observing. That's not how genuine highway safety problems behave. If there were physical factors making that stretch of road dangerous, they'd continue operating regardless of whether anyone was watching. The fact that the pattern tracked so closely with observation suggested something more complex was happening. I asked about the notebook I'd found, particularly the final entry where he'd written about needing to leave before becoming part of what he was studying. Ashford was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality, less academically confident and more personally uncertain. Sheriff, I spent 3 weeks at that motel, reviewing accident files, studying the patterns Mrs. Poe had documented, and trying to understand the mechanism behind the correlation. The more time I spent there, the more I became convinced that observation itself was the key variable. The Poes had watched the highway obsessively, documented every accident, and somehow that attention created conditions that made accidents more likely. He described experiencing what he called psychological resonance during his time at the motel, a sense that the location retained some imprint of all the death and grief it had witnessed. Whether that was a genuine phenomenon or simply the product of suggestion and isolation was something he couldn't determine objectively. But he'd found himself thinking constantly about accidents, anticipating crashes, imagining in vivid detail what it would be like to witness the kinds of tragedies the Poes had seen hundreds of times. That mental focus, he believed, might be recreating the conditions that had originally generated the elevated accident rate. The night I wrote that final entry, I'd been at the motel for 12 hours, working through files and organizing materials in room 14. I'd arranged the personal items in patterns, trying to understand the individuals they'd belonged to and the circumstances of their deaths. Around midnight, I heard a sound from the direction of the interstate, a sound I interpreted as tires screeching and metal impacting. I ran outside and looked toward the highway, expecting to see lights or smoke or some indication of an accident. But there was nothing. The interstate was empty and quiet. Ashford explained that he'd returned to the motel office and checked recent accident reports from the Arizona Department of Transportation for that section of highway. There had been no accidents reported that night or for several days previous, but he'd been absolutely convinced he'd heard a crash, so convinced that he'd been ready to call emergency services. That disconnect between his certainty about what he'd heard and the objective absence of any incident had shaken him profoundly. It suggested that his own mental state, shaped by immersion in accident documentation and focus on death, had created a perception that didn't correspond to external reality. That's when I understood what might have happened to the Poes, Ashford said. They'd spent 2 decades watching that highway, documenting accidents, thinking constantly about crashes and deaths. Their attention had become so focused on tragedy that they began seeing it everywhere, perhaps even unconsciously anticipating it in ways that created self-fulfilling prophecies. Drivers sometimes report feeling uneasy or distracted on certain stretches of road, sensing something wrong even when nothing objective supports that feeling. If the Poes were projecting expectation of accidents, radiating anxiety or foreboding in some subtle way, might that affect passing drivers, make them more nervous, more likely to make mistakes? The theory was speculative and difficult to prove, but it had a certain psychological plausibility. Environmental psychologists had documented how places could acquire emotional associations that affected people's behavior. Locations associated with tragedy sometimes became self-reinforcing, with people's expectations of danger creating heightened anxiety that led to exactly the kinds of accidents or incidents they feared. Whether such effects could operate at the scale and intensity needed to explain the Ash Road Motel's history was debatable, but it offered a framework for understanding the correlation between observation and accident rates. I asked Ashford why he'd left his belongings at the motel instead of collecting them when he departed. His explanation revealed just how disturbed he'd been by his final experiences at the property. "Sheriff, I left in a hurry after that night because I was afraid. Not physically afraid that something would harm me, but psychologically afraid that if I stayed longer, I'd become so immersed in death and tragedy that I wouldn't be able to separate my research from my own mental state. I felt like the motel was pulling me into its history, making me part of the pattern of observation and death. I got in my car and drove straight back to Tucson without packing up my materials. I know that sounds irrational, but the feeling was overwhelming." He'd been planning to return during daylight hours to retrieve his belongings, and had been working up the courage to do so when I called. The fact that I'd found his materials and identified him was almost a relief, he said, because it meant he had a concrete reason not to go back. He asked what would happen to his laptop and research materials, and whether he'd face criminal charges for trespassing. I told him that would depend partly on Mrs. Poe's willingness to press charges, and partly on whether District Attorney saw any public interest in prosecuting what was essentially academic research conducted in questionable circumstances. After speaking with Ashford, I called Mrs. Poe and relayed our conversation. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she asked me a question that cut to the heart of what bothered her about the entire situation. "Sheriff, do you believe what he's suggesting? That by studying the accidents, by maintaining the memorial, by keeping all this documentation at the motel, I might be creating conditions for the pattern to return? Because if that's true, I've spent 40 years making the same mistake my parents made, focusing so much attention on death that I'm somehow attracting more of it." It was a difficult question, and I tried to answer honestly. I told her that I didn't know whether Ashford's theories had any validity, but I couldn't dismiss them entirely either. The correlation between observation and accident rates was real, even if the mechanism behind it remained unclear. Whether that correlation represented causation, coincidence, or something more complex was beyond my ability to determine. But I could understand why both her father and Ashford had reached similar conclusions after spending significant time focused on the motel's history. "What I can tell you," I said, "is that maintaining files and memorial items in an unsecured, abandoned building in a remote location raises legitimate concerns beyond the theoretical questions about observation. You've attracted at least one researcher who was willing to trespass and spend weeks going through your materials. There are probably others who know about the location and might visit it. Some of them might not be as respectful or academically motivated as Ashford. If the files contain personal information about accident victims, there are privacy issues to consider as well." Mrs. Poe acknowledged these concerns but remained resistant to moving the materials from the motel. "Sheriff, I understand the practical problems, but I can't separate the documentation from the place where the history occurred. The motel is part of the story. Moving the files to some storage facility or archive would strip away the context that makes them meaningful. My parents suffered here. Hundreds of people died within sight of this property. That connection matters, even if I can't articulate exactly why." We discussed various options for securing the property better, perhaps installing locks on the room doors, or posting no trespassing signs more prominently. But both of us recognized that anything short of constant surveillance wouldn't prevent determined individuals from accessing the site. The motel was too remote, the area too vast to patrol effectively, and the story too compelling for certain types of researchers and curiosity seekers. As word continued to spread through online communities interested in anomalous phenomena, the site would likely attract more attention rather than less. I decided to drive out to the motel one more time before closing my investigation. I wanted to see the place again with everything I'd learned in mind, and to decide whether I believed Ashford's theories had any merit, or were simply the product of too much time spent alone thinking about death. The drive out felt familiar now, the access road less hidden than it had seemed during my first visit, the landscape less empty. I was starting to understand how location could become layered with meaning and history until it took on qualities that went beyond its physical characteristics. The motel looked unchanged, still abandoned, still deteriorating, still sitting in isolated silence under the vast Arizona sky. But knowing its history transformed how I perceived it. This wasn't just an old roadside motel that had failed economically. It was a place where people had witnessed tragedy on a scale that had broken them psychologically, where deaths had accumulated until they became a kind of presence in their own right, where the boundary between observation and participation had somehow become blurred. I walked through the property slowly, entering each room where Ashford had worked, standing in the spaces where he'd arranged accident reports and tried to find patterns in the deaths. In room 14, I stood among Mrs. Poe's memorial collection and tried to imagine what it would be like to spend hours here at night, handling objects that had belonged to people who'd died violently, trying to connect with their stories and understand their losses. The accumulated weight of so much death in one place was oppressive, and I found myself thinking about accidents, imagining crashes, anticipating tragedy in ways that felt intrusive and unwelcome. That's when I heard it. A sound from the direction of the interstate that might have been highway traffic or might have been something more specific. The screech of tires, the impact of metal, the compressed violence of a high-speed collision. I stepped outside quickly and looked toward the highway visible in the distance. Nothing. No smoke, no stopped traffic, no indication that anything had happened. Just the empty road stretching across the desert under afternoon sunlight. I stood there for several minutes, listening carefully and watching the highway. A few vehicles passed, traveling at normal speeds with no signs of distress or unusual behavior. The sound I'd heard, or thought I'd heard, didn't repeat. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been imagination, the product of suggestion after hearing Ashford's account of his own experience. But the certainty I'd felt when I first heard it, the absolute conviction that an accident had occurred, lingered uncomfortably in my thoughts. Back at my vehicle, I sat and looked at the motel one final time before leaving. The place seemed to watch back, and I understood viscerally what Ashford had meant about feeling pulled into its history. There was something about this location that demanded attention, that drew people into contemplating death and tragedy until those thoughts began to feel more real than the empty highway and quiet desert that actually surrounded it. Whether that quality was inherent to the place or created by the layers of observation and documentation that had accumulated over decades was impossible to determine. I called Mrs. Poe from my vehicle before driving away. I wanted to tell you that I've completed my investigation. No charges will be filed against Dr. Ashford, and I'll return his belongings to him. As far as securing your property goes, I'll include the motel in my regular patrol area, but I can't guarantee that determined individuals won't find ways to access it. The decision about what to do with the files and the memorial collection is ultimately yours to make. She thanked me for my time and thoroughness, then asked a question I hadn't expected. Sheriff, when you were at the motel just now, did you experience anything unusual? Did you hear or see anything that made you question your perceptions? I thought about lying, about dismissing my experience as nothing worth mentioning. But Mrs. Poe had been honest with me about her father's beliefs and her own uncertainties, so I decided to reciprocate that honesty. I thought I heard an accident on the highway, I admitted. I was absolutely certain I'd heard a crash, but when I looked, there was nothing there. It was probably just imagination, suggestion from learning about your father's and Dr. Ashford's experiences. But in that moment, it felt completely real. Mrs. Poe was quiet for a long moment before responding, and when she spoke, her voice carried a weight of recognition and something that might have been resignation. My father described the same experience, she said. During the years they operated the motel, he began hearing crashes that weren't there, seeing smoke from fires that hadn't happened, feeling absolutely certain that accidents were occurring even when they objectively weren't. He thought he was losing his mind, that the stress of witnessing so much death had broken something in his perception. But maybe it was something else. Maybe the attention, the focus, the constant anticipation of tragedy creates a kind of feedback where expectation becomes indistinguishable from experience. She continued, saying that she'd decided to remove the files from the motel and donate them to the Arizona Historical Society, where they could be properly archived and made available to researchers under controlled conditions. The memorial items in room 14 would be returned to families if possible, or respectfully disposed of if they couldn't be reunited with appropriate recipients. She'd continue to own the property and pay taxes on it, but she wouldn't maintain it as a research site anymore. The motel would return to being simply an abandoned building, slowly deteriorating in the desert, no longer weighted with the burden of so much documented death. "I think my father was right to walk away," Mrs. Poe said. "And Dr. Ashford was right to leave when he did. There's something about this place that draws people into contemplating tragedy until they can't separate their thoughts from reality. I've spent 40 years trying to understand it, and all I've learned is that some questions don't have answers we can live with. Some patterns are better left unstudied. Some places are better left alone." 3 weeks later, I helped Truett and a small crew that Mrs. Poe hired to remove the file boxes and memorial items from the motel. We worked quickly and efficiently, loading everything into a truck for transport to Tucson, where the Historical Society would take custody. The motel rooms looked even emptier after we'd removed the files, just bare spaces with deteriorating walls and floors, no longer serving even the marginal purpose of storage. As we finished loading the last boxes, Truett commented on how different the place felt without all the documentation of death that had filled it. "It's like the building can breathe again," he said. "All those years of accident reports and personal items from dead people, it was like the motel was suffocating under the weight of so much loss. Now it's just an old building falling apart, which is sad in its own way, but not nearly as heavy as what it was carrying before." I understood what he meant. The oppressive quality I'd felt during my visits, the sense that the place demanded contemplation of mortality, had diminished noticeably once the files and memorial collection were removed. Mrs. Poe didn't come to the motel during the removal process, saying she wanted to remember it as it had been when it still held the history she'd spent so long documenting. I spoke with her by phone afterward, and she seemed relieved that the materials were finally somewhere secure where they could be preserved properly and accessed by researchers who wouldn't have to trespass or risk psychological immersion in the kind of isolated obsession that had affected both Ashford and her father. She said she felt lighter, as if she'd been carrying physical weight that had finally been set down. I never saw Marcus Ashford in person. I arranged for his belongings to be shipped to his university office, and he sent me a brief note thanking me for handling the situation with understanding rather than prosecution. The note included an update on his research, saying that his experience at the motel had led him to reconsider some of his theories about observational anomalies. He'd concluded that while attention and expectation could certainly influence perception and interpretation, the mechanisms by which they might affect external physical events remained unclear and possibly unknowable. Some phenomena might simply operate at the boundaries of what scientific methodology could meaningfully investigate. In the months following the case, I found myself checking accident statistics for the section of Interstate 10 near the abandoned motel more frequently than I probably should have. The rates remained normal, consistent with other comparable stretches of highway, showing no indication that the pattern documented during the motel's operational years was returning. Whether that stability resulted from the removal of observation and documentation, or was simply the continuation of a trend that had started when the Poes closed the business decades earlier, was impossible to determine. The correlation existed, but causation remained mysterious. I drove past the motel turnoff occasionally during routine patrols, and each time I was tempted to take the access road and check on the property. But I resisted that temptation, remembering how easily attention could become obsession, and how contemplating tragedy could transform perception until imagination and reality became difficult to distinguish. The motel was better left alone, allowed to deteriorate naturally without the weight of human observation and documentation. Some places needed to be forgotten, their histories allowed to fade rather than preserved and studied until they became more real than the present moment. The Arizona Department of Transportation never found any conventional explanation for the elevated accident rate that had characterized that section of highway during the motel's operational years. Engineers reviewed historical records and couldn't identify design flaws, hazardous conditions, or any physical factors that would account for the statistical anomaly. Traffic safety specialists suggested the clustering might have been random variation that appeared meaningful only because someone had been documenting it carefully. The consensus was that the Ash Road Motel represented an interesting historical footnote, but not a genuine mystery requiring further investigation. That official conclusion satisfied most people, but it didn't satisfy me. I'd spent enough time at the motel, talked with enough people who'd been affected by its history, and experienced enough of my own unsettling perceptions there to believe that something more complex had been operating than simple coincidence or data collection artifact. Whether that something was psychological, environmental, or represented phenomena that current science couldn't adequately categorize, I couldn't say, but the pattern had been real, the correlation undeniable, and the psychological effects on multiple observers consistent enough to suggest genuine rather than imaginary phenomena. Sometimes, late at night when I'm working at my desk reviewing case files, I think about the Ash Road Motel sitting empty in the desert, slowly being reclaimed by the harsh climate and the relentless passage of time. I think about the Poes spending 23 years watching people die on a highway that should have been safe but somehow wasn't. I think about Mrs. Poe spending 40 years trying to understand her parents' suffering, and perhaps perpetuating the very pattern she was trying to explain. I think about Marcus Ashford fleeing the property in psychological distress after becoming too immersed in documenting death. And I think about my own experience of hearing a crash that didn't happen, feeling absolute certainty about something that wasn't real. The case remains officially closed with no criminal charges filed and no ongoing investigation. But in my mind, it's never been fully resolved. The Ash Road Motel exists in county records as a deteriorating structure on land owned by Verna Poe. It exists in Arizona Department of Transportation databases as a location associated with historical accident clusters that lacked conventional explanation. It exists in academic literature as an example of statistical anomaly and possible observational effect. And it exists in my memory as a place where the boundaries between attention and causation, between observation and participation, between what we think we perceive and what actually occurs, became uncomfortably blurred. The last time I drove past the access road leading to the motel was 6 months after helping remove the files and memorial items. I slowed down almost to a stop, looking at the barely visible tracks disappearing into the desert. For just a moment, I considered turning off the highway and driving out to see what the property looked like now that it had been stripped of the documentation and objects that had given it such oppressive weight. But I kept driving, recognizing that impulse for what it was. The same curiosity and compulsion that had drawn the Poes, Mrs. Poe, Ashford, and probably others to focus attention on a place that seemed to demand observation. Some places need witnesses. Some tragedies need documentation. But perhaps some locations operate according to different rules, where observation itself becomes participation, where attention feeds rather than illuminates, and where the act of watching creates the very phenomena being observed. The Ash Road Motel might be such a place, and if so, the best thing anyone can do is let it fade from memory, allow its history to become uncertain and its location forgotten, until it returns to being just another abandoned building in the vast Arizona desert, unremarkable and unremembered, no longer weighted with the burden of too much death and too much watching. The highway stretches on, carrying traffic between communities, connecting places and people, serving the purpose for which it was built. And somewhere along that highway, visible only if you know where to look and have reason to seek it, sits the Ash Road Motel, empty and silent, slowly disappearing into the landscape from which it emerged 70 years ago. Its story is preserved in archives and academic papers, but the place itself is being allowed to forget, to release the memories and observations that once gave it such dark significance. That forgetting might be the healthiest outcome for everyone involved, the most respectful treatment of a location that witnessed too much suffering and drew too much attention for too many years. I closed the case file and stored it in the archives, where it will remain unless someone has reason to retrieve it. The file is thorough and complete, documenting everything I learned about the Ash Road Motel, the elevated accident rate during its operational years, the research conducted by Mrs. Poe and Dr. Ashford, and the theories about observation and causation that emerged from investigating the location. Future law enforcement officers who might encounter questions about the property will find all the information I gathered and all the conclusions I reached, but they won't find answers to the deeper questions about whether attention can influence reality, whether some places demand witnesses, or whether the act of observing can sometimes become the thing that creates what's being observed. Those questions remain open, and perhaps they should stay that way.